This is a story about a magical world filled with all kinds of monsters, from cunning goblins to unknown creatures. The goblins were as numerous as ants and attacked in droves, but there were those who had no trouble dealing with them, no matter how many there were. Goblins were cunning and always tried to outwit their opponents. However, one day they came across a young man against whom their tricks didn't work. But the monsters didn't give up, even though most of their comrades had already been killed. Even their surprise attacks with bows were to no avail. The brave warrior was Ban Yuan. At first glance, he looked like an ordinary boy, but his skill level was exceptionally high. Using Bang Mang, his most powerful weapon, resembling a bat, he transformed it into something greater. Now it was a genuine automatic rifle, imbued with magic. That's what happens when you underestimate an opponent based solely on appearances. He hadn't always been such a strong young man, but from early childhood he had shown extraordinary abilities. By the age of 4, he was already reading books with ease, much to his parents' delight. They were even more amazed when the boy began reading in languages of countries that no one in the family had even heard of. Then his grandfather rushed into the room and declared that Yuan had inherited a rich ancestral lineage. Finally, he said, a child had been born who would fulfill a long-held family dream, to restore the Tower of Babel to their family's possession. The rest of the family was skeptical, deciding that grandfather was simply rambling in his old age. However, he was certain of what he was saying and wanted to show Yuan something. He told the boy a story about a great ancestor of the Ban family who once performed a true miracle. Possessing the ability to help people understand one another, he led the people and built a tower that would never collapse. The very Tower of Babel. The first thing that came to the young man's mind was wealth. Could their ancestor really have been the owner of this legendary tower? But his grandfather explained that their ancestor was merely a master linguist, capable of translating and transforming any language, and that the family must never forget what a great man he was. He convinced Yuan that as soon as their family found the tower again, they would regain their former glory and power. These words lit a spark in the boy's eyes. When he was very young, Yuan often listened to his grandfather's stories about their ancestors' adventures, and his grandfather hoped that the boy's extraordinary talent for languages would help him fulfill the family's dream. However, Yuan's abilities exceeded all expectations, and one day, a miracle happened. Right now, Yuan is just a high school senior, but thanks to his academic performance, he was hoping to get into a prestigious university, specifically to the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at S University. But he was starting to worry that the admission results were taking an unusually long time to be announced. Suddenly, something strange appeared on his laptop screen. Yuan didn't understand what was happening. An unfamiliar letter appeared before him, one that was difficult to read. The text was distorted and written in a language Yuan had never seen before. It seemed to state that he had been admitted to the best academy in an alternate reality, and that his documents had been accepted. Yuan didn't understand what kind of academy this was. After all, he was certain he hadn't applied there. Meanwhile, a timer appeared on the screen, counting down the time until his practical assessment. The young man decided that this must be some kind of prank by his sister, Ban Yumi. The garbled message disappeared, and a notification of successful admission appeared on the screen. Yuan was so happy that he completely forgot about the strange message, deciding it was just his nerves playing tricks on him. But the countdown was already coming to an end. Yumi walked into the room to see if he had been accepted, but when she opened the door, she found no one there. Meanwhile, Yuan had already been teleported to the site of the practical assessment for candidates from lower dimensions. Looking around, he realized this wasn't a game at all. He had truly been accepted into the academy. His task was to defeat a blind goblin and destroy the dungeon's core. The young man didn't understand what kind of practical assessment this was, since he hadn't applied anywhere. But the trial had already begun. His screams drew a crowd of blind goblins, and the young man was terrified by the sight of them. Since the goblins were blind, they relied solely on their hearing and sense of smell. Yuan realized that this was no time to be flustered. His life was in danger, and yet he still didn't fully understand whether he really needed to fight the goblins to get out of there. His head ached slightly from the fall, and his surroundings only intensified his fear. He began to think about how to defeat the two monsters in order to pass the test. While he was trying to figure out what to do, he accidentally made a couple of unnecessary noises. That was a big mistake. One of the goblins immediately lunged at him. Yuan realized his mistake and tried to be as quiet as possible. The goblins continued to prowl in search of prey, reacting to the slightest sound. The young man tried to stay calm, but he accidentally knocked over some rocks and made another noise. A blind goblin pounced on him at once, and it seemed as though the boy's end had come. But at the last moment, he managed to dodge the monster's attack. Although he managed to dodge it, the goblins didn't leave him alone and continued their search. That's when he realized that despite their blindness, their senses of hearing and smell were far keener. What's more, they hunted in packs, cornering their prey, and no matter how well he hid, they would find him sooner or later. If he didn't want to die so foolishly, he needed to come up with a plan fast. The only way out was to use their strength against them. Yuan picked up a few stones and threw them far away from himself. As expected, the goblins immediately rushed toward the sound, assuming their prey was fleeing. One of them, upon reaching the spot, realized they were just rocks and was slightly surprised. Meanwhile, the young man picked up a larger rock and hurled it straight at the monster. It wouldn't have been enough to knock out, let alone kill, a goblin that way, but it made the monster even more aggressive. One of the goblins thought the blow had come from behind, turned around and immediately struck back, only to find that it wasn't Yuan at all, but his companion. The goblins didn't even realize they were fighting each other, believing they were facing prey. In the end, Yuan managed to defeat them. Completely exhausted, they fell to the floor, their bodies piled on top of one another. However, the young man noticed that one of the monsters was still breathing, even though it couldn't free itself from under its companion's body, so Yuan had to deal with it himself. Despite his fear, he managed to finish off the goblin, because if he hesitated and failed to kill even this dying creature, he wouldn't be able to escape the dungeon. After that, strange things began to happen around him. A distorted letter appeared before him, stating that the first stage had been successfully completed. As a reward for his courage, Yuan receives the power of the higher dimension. He also now has access to the Babylonian Codex. The power of the Babylonian Codex has been activated. It will now be transmitted through the language's ideograms, that is, symbols that convey meaning through their form. Ideograms have also been registered. Unlike phonetic symbols, which represent sounds, these symbols convey concepts directly through their form. A common concept, demon and life, was extracted from the two goblins. Now the young man can extract and absorb the concepts of his opponents, depending on their level. Yuan's abilities are not limited to just knowledge of languages. He can now grow stronger by absorbing those he has defeated. He managed to absorb 0.2 of a demon. Since such concepts are beyond human control, it is recommended to store them in the Babylonian Codex and apply them to other objects. Yuan now has a choice, to save the concept for later or to apply it immediately, for example, to himself. The young man decided to try applying it to himself. He absorbed 0.4 life, after which he increased his life level to 10.4. His overall abilities and potential improved significantly. By absorbing 0.2 units of flesh, Yuan increased his strength to 10.2. His body became stronger and healthier. It wasn't just a feeling. His grip, legs, skin, and everything else had definitely grown stronger. And all of this was thanks to the fact that he had absorbed the essences of just 2 goblins using extraction and absorption. Afterward, their bodies vanished, leaving behind only their clubs. Since applying the concepts had worked on him, it would work on other objects as well. For example, a goblin's club. Using his newly unlocked power, Yuan quickly cleared out the dungeon of blind goblins. He also found the dungeon's core and destroyed it. With that, his special practical test was over, and the young man thought he would finally be able to return home. However, the place he was transported to was not his home at all. It turned out to be the Academy's dormitory. Yuan had found himself in a world he had never seen before, a place called the United Academy. After passing the exam, he was granted provisional student status, but he was more interested in where he was. He received a letter asking him to put on the uniform provided and then come in for an interview. Yuan still didn't understand what was going on. After all, he had just taken the entrance exams, and now he had to wear a school uniform again? The young man was unhappy with this turn of events. After all, he had just been on the brink of death, and now they wanted to interview him. And yet he agreed, intending to say exactly what he thought about the whole thing. At the very least, Yuan planned to demand compensation for such audacity, but his indignation vanished immediately when he saw the professor, who struck him as attractive at first glance. She had green skin and was clearly not human. Yuan was surprised and thought she might be an alien. She introduced herself as Yumina, a professor of magical combat at the United Academy, and was pleased to meet the young man. She also congratulated him on passing his practical exam, adding that the entire faculty had been watching him. Yuan wasn't particularly pleased with this news. Yumina informed him that he had become the first student in 500 years to create a new artifact during the exam. The young man didn't share her enthusiasm. After all, he'd been transported here without his knowledge. He hadn't understood a thing, and he'd nearly died. Perhaps it was simply because they came from different worlds and thought differently. Yu-Won had no intention of staying here and planned to leave immediately after the interview. Or rather, that's what he thought. Until he saw something that made him change his mind. A huge column towered before him, and he asked the professor what it was called. Yumina replied that she'd heard people from lower dimensions knew nothing about the Union or this column, and, as it turned out, that was true. She then added that this column was the reason the Academy had been founded. The Academy is dedicated to educating students with outstanding talents from all dimensions and helping them reach the summit of the tower. This is the mission of the United Academy and the last hope of all worlds. This was the very Tower of Babel, a dungeon among dungeons, the source of all the mysteries and dangers of this world. Yu-Won was thrilled. Could it be that all the stories his grandfather had told him as a child were true? Everything he had spoken of was right here. However, Yumina warned him that the tower was the dungeon of all dungeons, and it was most likely already overrun with monsters. But that didn't matter. Yu-Won was determined to restore his family's former glory. It was then that he decided to enroll in the United Academy. Thanks to the professor's special consideration, he was temporarily sent back home. There, Yu-Won gathered his entire family and told them what had happened. His grandfather was simply thrilled, and the young man now had the opportunity to prepare for admission. To do so, he went to the lower dungeon of the guild, the Hobgoblin Cave. That's where his training began. He easily defeated all the goblins that stood in his way. Finally, he managed to discover something new within himself. Until then, he had relied solely on his linguistic abilities. But now, everything had changed. Thanks to the Code of Babylon, he could verbalize, absorb, and control the concepts of objects. By defeating an enemy, Yu-Won is able to recognize and master its concept, and the more concepts he gathers, the stronger he becomes. He imbued the concept he obtained in the first dungeon, from the blind goblins, into the club he had acquired. He enhanced it and transformed it into a weapon that has now become his primary tool. It is no longer just a club, but the fearsome bat, a mace imbued with spectral energy and the first artifact created by Yu-Won. It is capable of revealing its true form at its owner's command, transforming and acting independently as an autonomous artifact. Because he created this artifact by accident, he received a good score on the evaluation. Among the concepts obtained from monsters was something Yu-Won had never encountered before: a soul. Unexpectedly, the mace began to sway from side to side, as if saying, "I want this." Along with the soul, Yu-Won decided to infuse a little more life into it, as well as the concepts of a ghost and a spirit. As he acquired even the most insignificant concepts, the young man used them to infuse the mace. He didn't fully understand what would happen when he imbued it with these concepts, but that only made it all the more intriguing. The concepts, united in perfect harmony, triggered a transformation of the artifact. The concepts, Ghost 2.5 and Beast 4, automatically merged. Their perfect synergy led to a fusion that transcended ordinary existence. Yu-Won was surprised to notice the beast concept. Could one of the concepts he had left behind have transformed on its own? Thanks to this transcendent fusion, the Phantom Beast 10 concept was completed. By combining the symbols of the Phantom and the Beast, the young man obtained a Phantom Beast. Her personality remained the same, and the young man wondered if she was still capable of transforming into a magical cannon or shield. From now on, this Phantom Beast would be called Eva, and before returning, Yu-Won decided to check his stats. They had increased significantly since the last time. His physical form seemed to reflect his stats, but Yu-Won was more interested in why his soul stat was so much higher than the others. He had also acquired the abilities All-Seeing Eye, Perfect Hearing, and Tongues of Babylon, which were possibly related to his linguistic skills. It was also interesting to see if Eva could surprise anyone, but it seemed she was certain she couldn't. It was time to leave the dungeon and return to the academy. Yu-Won was steadily improving his stats. The main thing was not to lose momentum. And now, the most important event was the admission ceremony for the United Academy. The ceremony was to take place in a special auditorium at the academy, designated exclusively for admissions. Other students were gradually filling the hall, taking their seats as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Yu-Won's sudden appearance surprised the students standing nearby. Yu-Won himself was also amazed to see how many people had come to the ceremony. He activated his all-seeing eyes, which allowed him to read auras and spirits. The higher their level, the more deeply the user could understand their surroundings. Just as the young man had suspected, Unlike him, who had been admitted through a special quota for lower dimensions, the regular students who had passed the standard selection process looked very strong, even at first glance. While Yuan was looking around for a seat, a couple of students had already approached him. They were the very type of people who look down on others because of their background. In his case, because he belonged to a lower dimension. Yuan didn't want any trouble, so he decided to quickly move away. Just as he'd expected, those who had passed the regular selection process had a very high opinion of themselves. Even here, the powerful and influential students looked down on those below them. Suddenly, someone called out to Yuan by name and told him that the specially selected students were located elsewhere. The phrase special selection students sounded impressive, but it felt more like isolation. Yuan was surprised to find that all these students were indeed from lower dimensions, just like him. However, their stats and abilities far surpassed his own. Each of them wasn't just a cut above him. They were several levels above him. Compared to them, only Yuan truly looks like a representative of the lower dimensions. They were at such a level that they could single-handedly take on students from the regular admissions track. Among them was S-Light, his roommate, who truly looked as if he were studying light. S-Light was surprised when Yuan called their rooms delightful. They had already met in the dorm before Yuan attended the ceremony, and their first encounter had been a bit awkward. At first, S-Light mistook him for an enemy, not realizing that he was a freshman and his roommate. He immediately apologized, blaming his nerves after the practical exam. At first glance, S-Light looked like a prince from a fairy tale, but he turned out to be quite hot-tempered. Yuan told him about his exam, which amused him quite a bit. After all, even a novice familiar only with the basics could handle goblins. S-Light, on the other hand, had to deal with a group of trolls and ogres. Yuan noted that it had been a long time since he'd talked so casually with anyone. After all, they'd met right after the exam, before he'd even had a chance to take a shower. That's why the young man wanted to head to the showers as soon as possible. Although the shower room was communal, S-Light still decided to continue the conversation right there. It seems that Yuan felt a slight sense of awkwardness after this encounter, and since these seats were reserved specifically for students in the special selection program, that meant the two girls sitting next to S-Light were also from his group. Yuan greeted them. One of the girls looked like the embodiment of kindness and cuteness. Her name was Rochelle. The other was more reserved, and the first thing that caught her attention was the snake coiled around Yuan's arm. Even though Eva was invisible, she managed to see her. Yuan introduced Eva to his new acquaintances. They were surprised when they saw her, but the young man was still wondering how they had managed to do it. S-Light asked if this was really the same artifact he'd had before, and how he'd managed to alter it so quickly in just a couple of days. Despite the cool reception, the girl took an interest in Yuan and introduced herself as Dak Gyun, the daughter of Master Murim. Yuan introduced himself as well and asked her about Master Murim. It turned out she practiced martial arts and could create gusts of wind between her palms. The young man was a bit too blunt in his remarks, which slightly amused the others. Dokoyan replied that he was absolutely right. She really did do that. In the distance, Yuan also spotted Yumin sitting among the other professors. S-Light asked if it was true that he had an interview with the professor. Yuan replied that he did, and for some reason thought S-Light had one too. But suddenly, something began to happen above them. The ceiling of the lecture hall was slowly opening up. A strange pressure appeared, causing the students' heads to start aching. None of them could withstand this inexplicable pressure. At that moment, a voice announced that everything was ready for the ceremony. Looking up, Yuan saw something strange that shocked him. It looked like a huge eye, announcing the start of the 2557th opening ceremony of the United Academy. After the ceremony, Yuan and the others gathered in Yumina's office. She was curious to know whether the students had been impressed by the president's speech, but for most of the students, it had caused more fear than pleasant surprise. Yuan replied that it was incredible and asked if that giant eye was really the president. His words shocked everyone, as many had been too frightened to even look up. After that, Dokyeon looked at Yuan warily. It seemed to her that he wasn't a student at all, but some kind of creature hiding behind a special ability. But Yuan continued, saying that, at the very least, it felt as if a huge eye was watching them. Yumina confirmed that it was indeed the president, and that they would most likely never see him again unless they achieved something extraordinary or caused an incident. However, it seemed that Yuan was in for a personal meeting with the president, though to him it felt more like a curse. Yumina added that the students' achievements were also her achievements as a professor. These words surprised S-Light. He asked Yumina if she would really be their advisor, to which she replied in the affirmative. S-Light was surprised, since they would be led by one of only 9 professors in the entire academy. The professor formally introduced herself as Yumina and explained that she teaches magical combat. Light asked if students weren't usually assigned mentors of a lower rank. Yumina replied that this was true, but that this year's incoming class was so unusual that the responsibility had been placed on her. So unusual, in fact, that it was surprising they'd been selected at all. The professor warned them to be careful of the envy and hostility from the other students. Yuan was surprised by her words. After all, the envy and hostility here go beyond ordinary rivalry. She was referring to actual confrontations and fights that even professors aren't allowed to intervene in. Yumina added that from now on, the four of them must stick together, since they are rare, specially selected students. To thrive among the others, they must be strong enough to ignore others' envy and hostility. And with that, they are now partners who must climb the tower together until the end of their training. Yumina then thanked them and informed them that the academy had prepared small gifts for them. She would explain the rules and other details after they received the artifacts. The artifact was so dazzling that it was impossible to look away. This pendant served as a sort of student ID that students were required to carry with them. With it, they could identify themselves, gain access to all campus facilities, and even teleport within the association's territory. The teleportation spell really worked, and Light and Rukiel were thrilled with the professor. Dokgoyeon, on the other hand, didn't show such enthusiasm. The pass was also required to enter the tower, so they had to keep a close eye on the pendants. Rochelle wondered why the others had left, but Yuan had stayed behind. Dokgoyeon speculated that perhaps it was because he was the only one who had sensed the presence of the eye. Just before tea, Yumin received a call about this very matter. Dokyeon immediately realized that something was wrong, since only Yuan had been able to look directly at the president. Meanwhile, Yuan sat in the office, overcome with excitement. A private meeting with the president on his very first day? What on earth had he done to deserve this? Suddenly, a voice began to emanate from the doll standing opposite him. He said that the young man could look at him calmly, since his true form wasn't there. The dean asked to be called Master and explained why he had summoned the young man. Usually, he doesn't interfere with a student's education. The weak remain weak, and the strong remain strong. Their lives depend solely on them. Whether they perish in the tower or achieve power and glory, the master doesn't care. Yuan tensed as he listened to the rector's monologue, not quite understanding what he was talking about. The master explained that he had a single goal: to see who could reach the summit. Nothing else mattered to him. He was talking about the Tower of Babel, which the Ban family has sought to reclaim since ancient times, along with all its power and glory. But Yuan is willing to risk his life to reclaim the tower. However, the master reminded him that the tower holds different meanings for the other students, and each one strives to climb to the top in their own way. So the young man asked the master what the tower actually represents. The master replied that the tower is a trial on the path to the divine. Upon hearing this, Yuan began to worry. What kind of deity awaits at its summit? By deity, he meant something like glory and dictatorship, where everyone bows down before a single lord. Yuan was excited, but he was even more curious about what was hidden at the top of the tower. The master continued, saying that he usually didn't interfere in his students' difficulties, but this time he would make an exception. This was because he saw potential in the young man, the greatest he had ever encountered. He promised to take steps to help Yuan climb to the top of the tower. Something strange began to happen with the young man's pendant, and it frightened him. But the master reassured him, saying that everything was fine. He had simply expanded his permissions to explore beyond the academy. Now he could venture into any dungeon. Yuan now had even more opportunities to hone his skills before climbing the tower. The master thanked the young student and sent him on his way, wishing him good luck. He added that the boy needed to improve his skills, and if his progress was noticeable, he would unlock the next privilege for him. Yuan didn't quite understand exactly what privilege he was referring to. The master explained that he would allow him to explore the tower on his own. Yuan was surprised to hear this. Finally, he added that he would look forward to their next meeting. As he emerged from the portal, he accidentally bumped into the professor. She just smiled and said that everything was fine. The dean always lets guests leave that way. Yuan told her about the conversation. The professor was surprised to learn that the master had given him permission to leave the academy. The young student didn't understand if this was really that important, to which the professor replied that not just anyone is allowed to do such a thing. Now he was free to explore the outer dungeons and visit the outer cities as he pleased, and that meant he would gain much more experience and training than other students. Yuan, however, thought that the master had given him this opportunity because he considered him too weak. so the privilege was akin to extra lessons. Yumina was even a little jealous of Yuan, since professors were usually so busy that they couldn't leave the academy at this time. She added that the Union was an academy where everything was arranged with the students' best interests in mind, which was sometimes inconvenient for the instructors. He could wander around the shops and enjoy the local delicacies as much as he wanted. Yumina recommended a nice town nearby, Ronica, so the young man set off for Ronica. The professor asked him to bring back 2 bottles of wine for the newlyweds, made by the temple priests. The drink was famous for its sweet, fruity aroma, rich bubbles, and long finish. Yuan couldn't refuse her, and he wasn't opposed to the idea himself, since there was sure to be something interesting in the city. On top of that, as a reward, he received an expanded inventory. Yuan remembered one of the items his grandfather had left him before he enrolled. The young man became curious about what kind of consumables his grandfather had prepared for him. He handed him the bag right before leaving, saying that it contained something he would soon need. The bag was so heavy that it felt as if it contained bricks rather than anything useful, and that turned out to be close to the truth. Inside were ingots of pure gold. His grandfather said the young man could take as much as he wanted. After all, it was the legacy of his ancestors, who had dedicated themselves to the search for the Tower of Babel. Now it all belonged to him. Thanks to his equipment, carrying them with him was no trouble at all. Grandfather also reminded him that gold is valued in any world, and that the time had come for the young man to set off for a new world. The city of Ronica really did look stunning. Even though it was a different dimension, the cityscape seemed familiar. While Yuan was admiring the streets, guards approached him and asked where he was from. After all, they hadn't seen him there before. As they drew closer, they noticed his student uniform and realized he was from the United Academy. They greeted him warmly and introduced themselves as guards of the western border of the Ronica academic town. They were curious. Had the rector himself granted him permission? Yuan confirmed that this was indeed the case. The master had allowed him to freely explore the area. They added that thanks to the hard work of the master and the academy staff, their city remained peaceful to this day, and they were grateful for that. The guards offered their help if the young man wanted to settle into the city. Without hesitation, Yuan raised his hand, pointed to one of the flying machines, and said he'd like to get one like that. He wondered how much it cost, though it wasn't really that important. His ancestors had left him plenty of money. Thanks to his inheritance, buying a hoverbike was no trouble at all. His excitement was through the roof. It had been a long time since the young man had felt this happy. Even the base model of the bike cost 250,000 roni. Expensive, but not for Yuan. The guards were surprised when the young man pulled out a gold bar and offered to trade it for the hoverbike. The exchange was far from equal. One gold bar was worth 7.5 million roni. Eva had been with him the whole time, and she too seemed eager to ride the bike. Yuan added the concepts of spirit and ghost to it, transforming the hoverbike into a living artifact. The young man named the new artifact Lilith, endowing it with a will of its own, just like Eva. He also bought some wine for the professor, so it was time to head back to the academy. But his joy was short-lived. The professor suggested they have a drink together. S-Light was disappointed in Yuan, because after their meeting, he had left without saying a word. On top of that, Yuan returned with a hangover, which angered S-Light even more. The young man admitted that he was truly sorry, but he couldn't refuse the professor. Furthermore, Yuan had now become the class representative. Dokyeon joked that he'd received the class representative badge in exchange for becoming the professor's drinking buddy. But the young man didn't mind that either. S-Light accepted it, albeit reluctantly. Dokyeon, on the other hand, was against this decision and believed that she should be the class representative. After all, she was the strongest among them. Dokyeon was convinced that she was even stronger than Yuan. S-Light was displeased with Dokyeon's words and considered them a strange way to express her thoughts. After all, they were supposed to be equal comrades. He would have liked to hear an explanation from her, since her attitude, as if she were above the others, was unlikely to bode well for their joint adventures in the tower. But Dokyeon didn't agree with S-Light. In fact, she found it rather amusing. It was amusing to her to hear about equal companions from someone who had asked the professor just yesterday whether students could climb the tower alone. S-Light replied that he was simply curious. That didn't mean at all that he didn't want to go into the tower with the rest of them. It seemed that the very hostility they'd feared was beginning to emerge. In fact, Yuan had planned to suggest that morning that they should at least come up with a plan in advance, but it looked like the group was already off to a rocky start. In particular, Yuan didn't want to be class president, but now he was beginning to understand why, out of all 4 of them, Yumin had chosen him specifically. S-Light is surprisingly ignorant, but his pride is ridiculously strong. Dokyeon is incredibly self-centered and strong, but she's bound to make enemies. And Rushul is surprisingly passive. She lacks the character to lead or mentor others. That's why Yu-won was the best candidate among the rest. And since he's the class president, it's time to take matters into his own hands. Yu-won says that the class president doesn't necessarily have to be the strongest, since he's responsible for other tasks. But Dokyeong disagreed with him. In her opinion, the class president must still be the strongest. Yu-won believes that since the strongest person is the class president, he will make all decisions on his own as he sees fit. The class president must be able to propose a fair and good solution for everyone. In that sense, he is the most accommodating. Dokyeon decided to back down, however, since it is the professor who has the authority to appoint the class president, as long as she agrees with their arguments. Although the only person she wants to follow is Yu-won, these words put the young man on edge. Dokyeon added that even if something bothered her, if she wanted to get what she wanted, she would have to put up with the unwanted as well. This further fueled the internal conflict within the class. Dokyeon left, and her final words really stung Eslit. The morning had indeed been difficult. Yu-won felt as if he were on a battlefield rather than at the university. It would take quite some time to resolve the issue of pride, but for now, they needed to come up with a new plan. The only one who didn't care about any of this was Rochelle. All she wanted was to pet Eva, Yu-won's living artifact. This place was full of secrets, and Yu-won's first class as class president of the 11th grade, a class filled with unique personalities, was full of surprises. And it was quite a challenge, since the lesson began with some serious difficulties. The first lesson would be a light sparring match between the two classes. The special students class was clearly outnumbered by the other class, and aside from numbers, they were even outmatched in ability. The teacher asked the students to choose an opponent with whom they wanted to spar. The students from the other class wanted to deal with the special students as quickly as possible. Each of them was eager to be the first to fight, but Yu-won's class didn't share that enthusiasm. On the contrary, they didn't understand the other class's eagerness. Eslit surmised that since the academy had divided the classes based on the students' abilities, the first special class hated the 11th. Moreover, Yu-won wore the class president's insignia, which further provoked his rivals. One of the opponents considered it arrogant to wear Professor Yumina's brooch and didn't agree with it. That's why he wanted to settle the score with them more than anyone else. Meanwhile, Professor Yumina didn't understand why her students had been scheduled to have a joint session with the special class on the very first day. Besides, real combat training was not a situation where a specially selected student from a lower dimension could possibly hold his own in a sparring match against someone from a higher class. It was likely that someone had intended to play a prank when drawing up the schedule, but the professor still sensed some kind of malicious intent. The first sparring match was scheduled to be between Yu-won and Erecto, but the young man replied that he couldn't do it, as his combat skills were still insufficient. For that, the teacher immediately deducted 3 points from their team and said that wasn't an excuse, so the match would go on. Yu-won didn't understand why the teacher was dragging his feet about the sparring match. Could it be to humiliate him in front of everyone? The young man added that he had been accepted as a student through a special selection process because of his unique abilities, not his fighting skills, so it would make more sense to evaluate him differently. After hearing Yu-won's words, the teacher became angry. It was unacceptable to him that a student would lecture him, so he deducted another 5 points for that. Yu-won said he'd agree to a sparring match, but only if he had a week to prepare. Then he wouldn't mind competing. In the young man's opinion, in a week, he would be able to enter the higher dimension and return from there stronger. At these words, everyone present in the arena fell silent. Not out of admiration, but rather because of the absurdity of what they'd heard. The students realized that in a week, he would be able to prepare for a sparring match against Erecto, and yet there were some among them whom Yu-won had intrigued with his words. After all, the young man claimed he could confidently face someone from the special class with just a week of preparation. The teacher wasn't particularly pleased with his proposal. After all, he had ignored him once again and set his own conditions, and yet he agreed to it. Next Tuesday, an official sparring match will take place between the two students, Yu-won and Erecto. The format will be completely open, and the entire academy will have the opportunity to watch the live broadcast. The teacher also added that since it was Yu-won who had requested the preparation period, he'd better show everything he was capable of. Yu-won replied that he would do his very best and was looking forward to the match against Erecto. But Erectos annoyed him even more, since it was quite difficult to see a worthy opponent in the boy. Yu-won also managed to find out his opponent's stats using the same all-seeing eyes. Literally every one of those stats surpassed Yu-won's, including even those of his friends. As he approached them, he noticed that they looked quite anxious. He asked if it was because of him. But they were more worried about Tokgoyeon, who was already warming up and ready to fight anyone. Unlike the class president, she specialized in combat. Tokgoyeon looked confident, knowing that her stats surpassed those of most, if not all, of those present. So she was ready to fight anyone. But looking at her, the other students completely lost any desire to fight. And that wasn't surprising because even Yuan, right before his own eyes, couldn't fully grasp the extent of Tokgoyeon's strength. It was simply impossible for the first-year students not to sense her overwhelming aura. She didn't understand what was going on. Was she really supposed to back down just because of their lack of confidence? So she decided to challenge Erectos to a sparring match, since he was the loudest of them all. Tokgoyeon was more than certain that he would agree to face her, and that she would easily defeat him. Erecto's original target was Yuan, so he didn't want to fight anyone else, let alone Tokgoyeon. If he fell for Tokgoyeon's provocation, she would indeed beat him up, and he'd be so badly injured that he wouldn't recover in a week. Not that Yuan cared. He didn't mind. He wanted this to happen, so he decided to try to stop Tokgoyeon. Yuan said that Erecto already had a sparring match scheduled with him, so if she wanted to fight, she should wait her turn. He was of course grateful that she stood up for him, but he would be able to defeat Erecto on his own. After all, he has to prove his worth on his own. Tokgoyeon thought Yuan was just a guy who relied on various tricks, but it turns out he has a bit of grit, so she doesn't mind. Erecto hadn't even had a chance to say a word before everything had already been decided for him. Meanwhile, Tokgoyeon's desire to compete with someone hadn't subsided, so she asked once more if anyone wanted to fight her, but as expected, the only response was silence. No one even wanted to try to stand up to her. Tokgoyeon was disappointed. Just a couple of minutes ago, they'd been so boisterous and eager to compete. But as soon as someone stronger stepped forward, their barking died down immediately. She literally called them dogs, and one of the students wasn't happy with such blunt remarks. He added that the weak and the foolish always band together in packs, growling and pretending to protect their little groups. That's why a sight like this is simply a joy to behold. Even considering that he was a student in the special class, his aura stood out from the rest. He was like a bird of a completely different caliber. S-Light noted that this guy's name was Ortima, and he was the ruler of the Ketius dimension. Yuan hadn't exactly never heard of Ortima. He didn't even know such a dimension existed. S-Light added that, aside from the Union, there are 10 higher dimensions. Ortima comes from the family that rules one of them, Ketius. So he comes from one of the top 10 families across all dimensions. Before the sparring session began, Ortima asked the teacher to turn on the recording device to capture their sparring. Yuan didn't understand why they were doing this, but S-Light replied that it was necessary so they could later post the video on the intranet. Yuan replied that he knew the intranet was a network created by educational institutions for sharing information. S-Light was surprised when the young man told him this, since he had come from a lower dimension and didn't even know about the Union. So how did he learn about the intranet? Meanwhile, the students found a live stream of the sparring match between Tokgoyeon and Ortima. Now, anyone who wants to can watch their fight, including the Academy's students. For some reason, the teacher wants to put specially selected students in an awkward position, but it's unlikely he'll succeed. The aura of the two opponents was simply off the charts. It didn't seem like Tokgoyeon was any weaker than Ortima. Tokgoyeon didn't even mind letting him make the first move, calling him a novice. Ortima was surprised when she called him a novice, so he wanted to demonstrate that he was an experienced warrior. He used a technique capable of distorting nature and exerting pressure on his opponent. Yuan experienced something like this for the first time, so he didn't immediately grasp the essence of his technique. Its power was significantly different from the one Yuan wielded. It was like water flowing from top to bottom. On top of that, the air grew heavy, and it became difficult to breathe. It felt as if everything around him was contracting and collapsing from within. It forces you to fall to your knees, as if it were the most natural thing a young man could do. Yuan realized that his technique was a distortion of the laws of nature. S-Light was surprised to learn that Yuan had just figured out how his ability worked. Meanwhile, Rochelle was growing uneasy. She was very frightened and tried to hide behind Yuan. But it wasn't Ortima's technique that frightened her at all. It was the power that Tokgoyeon possessed. She increased her energy effortlessly. In doing so, she was able to completely suppress her opponent's energy as if it were nothing. Yuan was thrilled. He knew Tokgoyeon was strong, but he hadn't realized she was this powerful. Ortima was also pleasantly surprised by his opponent's abilities. It seemed she really was capable of something, just as he'd thought. Tokgoyeon, however, was not impressed. To her, such a technique was weak. She called his power just as ridiculous as his horns. But Ortima's attack didn't end there, and he planned to strike again. But Dokoyon wasn't about to stand idly by anymore. With incredible speed, she suddenly attacked her opponent, and quite successfully. Ortima hadn't expected such a swift attack from Dokoyon. She, in turn, didn't want to let him attack twice, since his attack was too predictable, and grew stronger the closer he got. Ortima's confidence gradually waned, and he decided to fight in earnest, now using both hands. But Dokoyon seemed to be one step ahead, or, to be more precise, already behind him. Ortima tried to attack her, but the girl's agility allowed her to dodge effortlessly, and then she would strike back at her opponent. She called his movements stiff and clumsy. Dokoyon was disappointed because she had thought Ortima would be much stronger. Ortima was even more enraged by his opponent's words that he was weak and clumsy. Eslight was thrilled to watch Dokoyon effortlessly dominate Ortima. She was literally crushing him, leaving him no chance of winning. Yuan noticed that Ortima looked as if he was simply accustomed to neutralizing his opponent's attacks. He wasn't used to fighting, relying solely on his technique of distorting the laws of nature, and when faced with an opponent like Dokoyon, who was capable of neutralizing his technique and then attacking in close combat, he became vulnerable. Sparring with Dokyon proves that his method doesn't always work. Undoubtedly, Ortima possessed talent and potential. You certainly couldn't call him weak. He possessed the power to overpower his opponent in physical prowess, yet he himself remained stationary. Eslight was surprised at how Yuan had noticed all of this. Dokgoyan, who fights on equal footing with Ortima, and Yuan, who is observing both of them at the same time. They are truly special selection students from the lower dimensions. It was hard to keep track of the sparring. Only one thing was clear. Dokgoyan was in the lead. All Ortima could do was defend against her attacks. To him, it felt more like an insult, and that made him even angrier. But Dokgoyan didn't let up and continued to attack her opponent. Suddenly, Ortima dared to counterattack her. He was beside himself with rage and had no intention of enduring any more humiliation from her. Now he didn't just want to defeat her. He wanted to kill her. But Dokyon simply replied that the concept of death was not something a child like him should be talking about. Now it's not just a sparring match to assess their abilities, but a real fight to the death. It seemed as though one of the students was about to land a blow so powerful that it would kill their opponent. But fortunately, Professor Yumina appeared at that moment and stopped their sparring. Her technique was like slowing down time. Suddenly, everything around them froze. Flowers appeared in the arena, as if she had transported them to a flower-filled meadow. Yumina also noted that battles to the death among students are not encouraged at the academy. Therefore, she would prefer that their energy be spent on clearing the tower. The entire arena resembled a field filled with flowers, and bright, beautiful petals were falling from the sky. The sight was extraordinarily beautiful and remarkable. Witnessing it was truly a stroke of luck. Yuan thought it was just an illusion, but for an illusion, the scent of the flowers was too strong. The students, of course, were not happy with the professor's interference, as they had still not determined which of them was stronger. Ortima said nothing and simply turned around and walked away. Dokyon was also surprised at just how strong Professor Yumina actually was. Returning to her friends, she asked them what it looked like from the outside. Yuan replied that it had indeed been amazing. Just then, Rushel bumped into Yuan's back while hiding from Dokgoyan. While the others marveled at her strength, she was still frightened. Yuan found something endearing in her actions, while Dokgoyan found it more infuriating. Meanwhile, the professor reprimanded Teacher Farrell for deciding to have the students spar right from the very first class. Such behavior is not acceptable at the academy, so he will face punishment. The instructor apologized and said he realized his mistake, but the professor simply replied that a simple apology wouldn't be enough. Approaching the students in her class, she also noticed that Yuan's badge was upside down. Yumin said that for the class president, dignity is everything, so he shouldn't wear the badge that way. It seemed as though all the conflicts among the students had subsided, but the professor's actions sparked yet another one. After that, the other students began to hate Yuan even more. Meanwhile, the entire internet was abuzz with discussions about Dokgoyan and Ortima's sparring match. Everyone was thrilled that a girl from a lower dimension had been able to fight on equal terms with the ruler of Kedius. The incident involving Yuan and the professor also drew significant attention. After that, the young man gained considerably more detractors. The entire intranet was abuzz with discussions about the incident that had occurred that day. Dokgoyan didn't use social media much, so it all seemed strange to her. She was also surprised that many considered Ortima to be promising. She, however, was convinced of the opposite. Back then, in the arena, she'd noticed someone more talented than him. Dokgoyeon asked if Yu-won had seen her, but he replied that he hadn't since he'd been focused on her sparring match. The guys weren't familiar with internet slang either. S-Light, of course, tried to figure out what people were writing about them, but it was difficult. Everyone was talking about nothing but Yu-won and Dokyeon's sparring match. And speaking of everyone, S-Light noticed something strange. Didn't Rochelle always sit so far away from them? Had something happened? She looked scared because of Dokgoyeon and couldn't even get close to her. Yu-won couldn't imagine how they shared a room. Maybe she was just nervous after the sparring session. So Yu-won, as class president and as a friend, decided to cheer everyone up by pulling some jam out of his inventory. It was 1,000 fruits concentrate, a special elixir jam that he'd managed to create. In addition to its amazing taste, it helped boost stats. Looking at the jar of jam, S-Light and Dokgoyeon were surprised and didn't quite understand what was going on. Yu-won opened the jar and asked for some bread. The aroma of the jam was so remarkable that it even reached Rushel, who was sitting at the edge of the table. Yu-won spread the jam on the bread, and it glistened as if it were molten gold. The taste was so sweet that it was impossible to describe in words. The young man was glad that his friends liked the jam he had made himself. The taste was incredible. Dokyeon added that she'd had a chance to try all the delicious foods from the Central Plains, but this was on a completely different level. Rochelle also wanted to try some, but she was too afraid of Dokgoyeon to join in. Still, she managed to overcome her fear and try the bread with fruit jam. Just as she expected, the taste was amazing. It was something completely new to her. It was so delicious that Dokyeon asked Yu-won to make another batch of that concentrate. He, of course, didn't mind. According to her friends, the taste felt like something precious. But Yu-won replied that wasn't quite the case. It wasn't too expensive, but since they were on the same team, it was nice to share something good. So this could be considered a token of gratitude for the kindness they had shown him earlier. Dokyeon decided that, in exchange for the elixir, she would teach him martial arts. She'll teach him all the basics and other skills he needs, so that Yu-won can fight Erecto with dignity. Together, they teleported to the training ground to begin his martial arts training. There was enough space there to move around freely. Yu-won hadn't even finished eating when Dokgoyeon teleported him to the training room. He was curious about what she was going to teach him, but Dokgoyeon ignored him and immediately began the lesson. The first thing he needed to learn was not to make any sudden movements. Movements had to be smooth and performed with maximum concentration. So the first technique wouldn't be difficult. Before Yu-won could even blink, Dokgoyeon's sword was right in front of his eyes. He was surprised by her speed and skill. If this had been a real fight, he wouldn't be alive anymore. Dokgoyeon called it the piercing strike. This would be the first strike Yu-won mastered. Performed without the slightest hesitation or doubt, it was hard to believe that this piercing attack had been executed by a living being. However, Yu-won managed to notice something in that brief moment. It was a new concept of piercing, which Dokyeon had used to execute this attack. Yu-won didn't understand why it was specifically piercing. Wasn't that closer to fencing? He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear a word Dokgoyeon was saying to him. She went on to explain that a thrusting strike does not exist on its own, outside of a combination, and can serve as the finishing move for anything. But that didn't matter. What she was showing him was the most basic and fundamental essence of the thrusting strike. His ability to use it depends on how often he delivers a thrust. It's also important to consider where he delivers the thrust. It's important to consider what he's trying to emulate when he delivers a thrusting strike against the enemy, and ultimately what intention is behind this strike. Dokjeon noted that these are the fundamental principles of the thrusting strike. There are also countless variations, but the foundation remains the same. Yu-won was delighted by Dokgoyeon's martial arts skills. He conducted a brief analysis of Dokyeon's movements, which perfectly embody the single concept that felt far deeper than a few concepts mixed together. Now it was Yu-won's turn to try performing a thrusting strike. Yu-won warned her that of course it would be a pitiful imitation, but he would try anyway. Dokyeon replied that if he could perfectly copy her movements on the first try, it would mean that all the years she had spent honing her mastery of that strike would have been meaningless. Yu-won attempted the strike, and it was very similar to what Dokyeon had demonstrated. She was delighted to see that he had managed to grasp the essence of it after watching her move just once. But Yu-won felt that this wasn't quite right. He needed to focus more to replicate the strike. Up until then, he had been too focused on combining concepts and thought it was enough to strengthen them simply by combining them or adding new ones. But that wasn't all. His power could increase even further by perfecting what he had already mastered. A question arose in Yu-won's mind. If there were many symbols for a piercing strike, why had he chosen piercing specifically? He used it because, for him, a thrusting strike means piercing the target without fail. The goal is to pierce the opponent quickly and powerfully, delivering a fatal blow. The more Yuan delved into this, the better he became at replicating Dokyeon's strike. She was delighted by how quickly the young man was learning. Still, there was no point in exhausting himself right from the start, so they could call it a day. Dokyeon advised him to use the strike when he had more space, and against an enemy he could defeat. Thanks to Dokyeon's training, Yuan unlocked new stats and improved his existing ones. He was surprised that he was able to improve his stats just by swinging his sword a few times. He grasped the martial arts concepts of piercing and fencing. At first, Yuan thought he had only slightly improved his stats. His stats had skyrocketed, and he had only just learned about the concept of piercing, yet it was already at level 16. On top of that, his fencing skill, which hadn't increased at all no matter how many goblins he'd defeated, had risen to level 20. The young man's combat skills had doubled, an astonishing result. Dokyeon hadn't expected him to grasp the essence of the strike so easily. She hadn't even thought that Yuan would be able to demonstrate the very essence of the technique, even with a training sword. He replied that he had simply copied her, but Dokyeon countered that if that were the case, why couldn't everyone master the strike like he did? Yuan added that perhaps it was because she was a good teacher. After all, when he first saw the thrusting strike, he was able to sense the full depth of her movements. Yuan was surprised that anyone could even reach such a level of mastery. This made Dokyeon uncomfortable, and she didn't understand how he could say such embarrassing things when they didn't know each other well enough yet. In any case, Yuan was sincerely grateful to Dokyeon for the lesson, and truly enjoyed learning from her. She could keep the elixir for herself, to which Dokyeon replied that it was hardly equivalent to the time she had spent teaching him. Yuan didn't know what to do in that situation, how to make up for her time, but Dokyeon replied that it was all right, and that in time he would make up for her loss. It was the first time Yuan had seen her smile so sincerely. From their first meeting, he had thought of her as cold and unapproachable, but the more he got to know her, the friendlier she became. Training was over, and it was time to return to the academy. Meanwhile, things were far from boring at the academy either. One event followed another. Since Rochelle was very attractive and sweet, many guys tried to get to know her. And their main tactic was to demonstrate their strength in front of her, thereby supposedly proving their masculinity. Of course, Rochelle didn't want to get to know anyone, so she tried to turn them down by any means necessary. But luckily, S-Light was right there beside her at that moment, and he wouldn't let anyone take advantage of her. He stood up for her and said that if anyone wanted anything from her, they should tell him. In response, the man called him a nobody from a lower dimension, which made S-Light even angrier. Just then, Dokyeon and Yuan returned from their training. Dokyeon noted that they'd arrived just in time. It was only just beginning, while Yuan suggested that the friends go somewhere. The detractors decided to back off, but only for now, promising to return. Yuan asked S-Light what had happened, but the only response was silence. The trouble didn't end there. Those guys were also present during history class, and they continued to stare at Rochelle, ignoring the teacher's remarks and requests to stop. The teachers also turned a blind eye to their inappropriate behavior. This put a lot of pressure on Rochelle and severely disrupted not only her studies, but also her daily life. Yuan and S-Light couldn't just stand by and watch their friend being bullied, so they started coming up with a plan. No matter where they were, whether in class or elsewhere, they continued to harass her. The professor ignored the trio, but S-Light decided to intervene and bring the matter to his attention. S-Light said that some students were being very noisy and making it hard to concentrate on the lecture, and asked if the professor could step in, but the professor ignored him, replying that students shouldn't talk during the lecture so as not to lose focus. S-Light and Yuan were surprised by the professor's decision, since he was the one who was supposed to fight for justice and the students' safety at the academy, yet the opposite was happening. The trio continued to harass the boys, but now S-Light had become the center of their attention. They hadn't liked him even back when he stood up for Rochelle, and after that, he became their #1 enemy. They didn't understand why he was trying so hard. Perhaps they were dating, which was why he was standing up for her so fiercely. S-Light could no longer tolerate the nonsense spouted by his detractors and was ready to start a fight right in the middle of class. But Yuan asked him to calm down and think the situation through calmly. S-Light didn't understand why Yuan was telling him to back down. After all, it was about their classmate. But Yuan argued that it wasn't worth getting involved in such nonsense. Causing trouble in class would only make things worse, so they needed a different plan. For example, you can use the internet. The professor streams his lecture on YouTube so that other students can listen to it as well. But the camera was positioned in such a way that the three of them weren't visible. So Yu-won wanted to move the camera closer to them so that not only could they be seen, but their conversation could also be heard. Now everything they say can be seen and heard live. All thanks to Eva, who was holding the camera and was practically invisible. Meanwhile, the comments didn't take long to appear. Viewers began condemning those guys and asking what the professor was doing at that moment. Yu-won also titled the live stream, "The Story of Unity," to attract even more attention. Rushel was grateful to her friends, but she was worried that this might cause trouble. Suddenly, the three guys noticed the live stream and immediately started looking for the camera. They started looking for the camera and the person who had started the live stream. After a while, they finally managed to find Eva, who was holding the camera. They started shouting to the entire lecture hall that it was all S-Light's doing and that this was his snake. At that point, the professor intervened. The professor was extremely upset that the students were disrupting his lecture and ordered them to state their names and class and then leave the lecture hall. They tried to explain themselves to him, but the professor was so angry that he simply kicked them out of the lecture hall. His anger knew no bounds. He promised to give them Fs for the rest of the year and reminded the students once again not to disrupt the class and to listen carefully. Yu-won and S-Light weren't happy with the teacher's decision, since those guys had said so much about Rochelle. And in the end, their only punishment was failing grades. But Rushel convinced the boys that everything was fine. That was enough. She was incredibly grateful to her classmates for not leaving her in the lurch. This made Yu-won feel a little embarrassed, and he replied that he just wanted to help. There was no need to thank him. Rushel was happy that she finally had such kind friends. S-Light was also glad that everything was okay with Rushel now, and added that he was still glad that Yu-won was the class representative. Dokjeon shared the same opinion as the rest of the group, and yet the group's main troubles weren't over yet. In the next class, they ran into them again, and this time, the trio looked even more menacing. The kids thought they were finally done for, but that turned out not to be the case. But this time, their target wasn't Rochelle, who seemed defenseless at first glance. Now their target was S-Light, whom they wanted to take revenge on for the incident with the camera. Thinking it was him, they demanded an explanation from him for what had happened yesterday during class. After all, it was because of that live stream that their grades for the semester had been ruined from the very beginning. On top of that, because of this incident, their classmates were now avoiding them. But what bothered them even more was that the teacher made no attempt to intervene in the situation, as if he didn't even notice them. It seems that the faculty really doesn't consider students from the lower dimensions to be human beings. The tension escalated, and it seemed as if a fight was about to break out. But S-Light didn't want to continue the conversation with them in that tone. He explained to them that if they wanted to talk to him, they should ask him more politely, not like savages. This angered them. They were ready to fight, despite the teacher's presence. Such a response angered them even more. They could not tolerate being spoken to in that tone by someone from a lower dimension. But E-Slide wouldn't stand for it and drew his sword, knocking his opponent's sword out of his hands. The conflict escalated even further. Yu-won and the rest of his classmates were surprised by this turn of events. Yu-won's astonishment knew no bounds. Using his eyes, he also noticed that S-Light was employing a new technique. S-Light lost his composure and was enraged by his detractors. Out of fear, one of them drew a blade, but compared to S-Light's sword, it looked ridiculous. S-Light told them once again that he would only speak with them if they asked him politely. S-Light, who usually looked like a whiny young man, suddenly resembled a brave knight. Yu-won was also surprised at how S-Light had suddenly changed completely. He couldn't believe such a thing was possible. Perhaps it was because of his sword. Maybe his sword possessed some strange properties. E-Slide exerted such intense pressure that his opponent couldn't even move. Dokjeon also found his abrupt change in behavior strange. Meanwhile, S-Slide asked the teacher what kind of evaluation the academy would give to a group that suddenly attacked their classmates with real swords during class. To which the teacher replied that the academy does not encourage unsanctioned sparring, so there could be punishment for that. After all, S-Slide hadn't agreed to spar, so the incident could be considered an attack. The teacher said that was true, but the student had drawn his personal artifact, to which S-Light replied that he had simply reacted to their attack. S-Light argued his case, maintaining that even if they had started a fight, the teacher would have simply stood by and watched. His words began to anger the professor. S-Light asked him what the teacher would do about the insults and slander hurled at him, to which he merely replied that he hadn't noticed any. This sent S-Light into a rage, and he thrust his sword toward his opponent's face. The young man could no longer control his anger, and was dissatisfied with the professor's decision. But fortunately, Dokyeon stopped him with a powerful slap. She merely slapped him, but with such force that S-Light immediately came to his senses. Dokyeon told him that he needed to be more restrained. Rather than drawing his sword, brandishing it, imagining himself all-powerful, and acting arrogantly, S-Light's energy vanished, and the teacher was no longer standing on the sidelines. He had indeed treated S-Light that way simply because he was from a lower dimension. Meanwhile, Yu-Won and Rochelle continued to stand on the sidelines so as not to get involved in the commotion unnecessarily. Dokyeon, however, continued to scold S-Light, saying that this was his true nature when he had a divine weapon in his hand. After this outburst, Yu-Won suggested to the others that they stop getting involved in such things, because otherwise they wouldn't be treated well at the academy. S-Light didn't think Yu-Won was the right person to be giving him a lecture, to which Yu-Won replied that he wasn't the one who tried to pick a fight with the professor. Besides, he had made an official request for the sparring match, unlike S-Light. S-Light thought he'd be able to turn the situation around, just as Yu-Won had done last time. But in the end, he nearly caused a major problem. Yu-Won didn't understand why S-Light had left the instigator alone and immediately tried to pick a fight with the teacher. If he'd been in his normal state, he wouldn't have acted so recklessly. But it seemed as if he'd suddenly changed, as if someone had flipped a switch. On top of that, his sword. Yu-Won asked S-Light to be honest with him and inquired about the power he had displayed earlier, wondering if he could control it. S-Light replied that of course he could, otherwise he wouldn't have passed the entrance exam. But at the time, he had been angry because of the professor's lie. Yu-Won noted that this was true, since lying is wrong, and S-Light, shifting his gaze, said that was exactly the case. He asked again if he could trust that S-Light was in control of his power. S-Light assured him that was exactly the case, and that he wouldn't cause any more trouble. Dokyeon also added that she was glad that at least S-Light had said he wouldn't cause any more trouble, but watching his artifact smash him had been quite entertaining. S-Light was grateful that his friends trusted him, but he was still a little hurt. Dokyeon also said that she was beginning to understand the professor's advice, that they should be more considerate toward other students. After all, if they continued in the same vein, student life would become even more chaotic than it already was. That's why she was curious to know what Yu-Won, as class president, thought about this. Over the past few days at the academy, Yu-Won had definitely realized the cause of the concern, the mindset of those around him based on inner strength and superiority, an inexplicable contempt for the lower dimensions, which made everything easier for people from the higher dimensions, and the established norms that had formed over the years, which regarded this as the natural order of things. Yu-Won was faced with a question. What could outsiders do in a place where such attitudes were considered the norm? So he asked his classmates what they thought was needed to establish mutual understanding or gain recognition from any sufficiently large group. S-Light suggested conversation. Dokyeon, strangely enough, suggested strength. Rochelle, however, refrained from answering. Yu-Won said that was close, but still not quite what was needed. He noted that what really matters to them is exactly how they appear in the eyes of others. That's why they decided to create a channel about their daily lives. They'll craft an image of themselves to present to those around them. This image will become ingrained in people's minds and make them easily recognizable, which, in turn, could lead to honor and respect. But S-Light didn't quite understand. If what matters most to them is the admiration and respect of those around them, then why does he need to spar with Dokyeon? Yu-Won replied that this wouldn't be a typical show. It would be a sparring match by the rules, so he'd better take it seriously. The sparring match between Dokyeon and S-Light began, and S-Light had some concerns about what was happening, but Dokyeon said that Yu-Won shouldn't worry that S-Light might not take the fight seriously. After all, people tend to take things much more seriously after taking a couple of hits, so it was just a matter of time. And in the meantime, S-Light had a rough time of it. Yu-Won thought it must hurt, but at the same time, it made for good footage for their channel. Dokyeon began to tease S-Light a little. Was that really all he was capable of? And it seemed that he really was nothing without his artifact. She didn't mind if he pulled it out, but even then, she'd still be able to defeat him. Her words stirred up real anger in S-Light, similar to what he'd felt during class when he'd drawn his sword. But Rochelle had reservations about Yu-Won's idea. Would it really make their life at the academy easier? Yu-Won wasn't sure it would work, but it would have some effect. After all, if those guys had known from the start what they were capable of, they would have thought 1,000 times before messing with them. Meanwhile, the intensity of the sparring between classmates was picking up steam, so Yu-Won asked her not to jump to conclusions because her beauty was too precious for her to worry about. He also added that her pretty face looked even better when she smiled. No matter where she went with that face, she could win over anyone. so it would be an unforgivable waste for her to frown. It was better to save her worries for later. Rushiel was pleased to hear this from Yuan, while S-Light walks away from the battlefield, as he has no intention of fighting this monster. The next face on screen was Rushel's, specifically a video of her eating noodle soup, albeit with a generous amount of cilantro. Yuan assured her that everything would be fine and that she'd get used to the taste. Following Yuan's suggestion, the 11th grade class began uploading videos of their daily lives to the newly created Uprising channel. Their videos literally blew up the intranet and made them famous. People loved everything they filmed, including Dokyeon and S-Lead's sparring sessions. Videos of them all playing board games together also became popular. Even the video of them having tea in Yumina's office racked up a lot of views. And, as expected, the video featuring Rushel became one of the most popular thanks to her cuteness. Everyone loved their videos for their simplicity, and everyone was even more intrigued by the upcoming livestream, where they planned to conquer the tower. The guys were simply thrilled at how quickly they'd managed to gain recognition on YouTube. Their channel already had over 1,000 subscribers in just one day, but Aslida was still bothered by why the video of him getting beaten up by Dokgoin had become the channel's most popular one. Professor Yumina was also happy for her students, because Unity is a higher dimension full of true miracles. In a world where miracles are taken for granted, no one had even thought to create content around them. But this channel and the content they create fit perfectly into the concept of an ordinary miracle. The connection between them and the atmosphere were simply amazing. However, today was the first day they would enter the tower. The professor was worried about the students, so she asked them to be careful and made sure everyone was fully prepared. Yuan was the only one among them wearing a school uniform. He found this quite embarrassing. The fact was that Yuan had lived in a peaceful place, so he didn't have any special clothing for battle. Still, this was the life he had chosen for himself, and the place where he would fight, risking his life. So his clothes didn't matter to him, and since everyone was satisfied and ready, it was time to head to the tower. Once they arrived at the tower, the other participants noticed them right away. They immediately recognized them as the very same guys from the Uprising channel. The tower opens at dawn, but entry is granted based on training level. Thanks to their fame, they were placed in the second-year student group. There were also those in the tower who weren't particularly happy to see them, such as the very trio that had been harassing Rushel and then S-Light. But this danger seemed insignificant compared to another, more pressing problem. After all, Erect was also there, staring at them with a clear desire to kill. So today is the day they conquer the tower. And shortly after that, sparring with Erecto. There were only 4 days left, and during that time, Yuan had to become stronger. During that time, he intends to reach a level where Erecto won't even be able to lay a finger on him. The professor also noted that, for safety reasons, she would like the students to finish early and return before the weekend, but that decision was up to them, not her. So she was curious to know how long they thought it would take to conquer the tower. After discussing it, the group came to a consensus. It would take them 2 nights and 3 days. In that time, they would be able to conquer the tower and return in time. For Yuan, however, conquering the tower meant more than just academic success or the outcome of his sparring match with Erecto. Above all, he wanted to show his ancestors that their legacy would live on. Before setting out, the students asked the professor if it would be possible to film inside the tower. This would be handled by an artifact with a personality, created in the likeness of Eve and Lilith. But the professor noted that the footage would likely be of little use, since the tower is characterized by a constantly changing structure. E-Slide had also read about this in the manual. It stated that the tower's internal layout is constantly changing, and the equipment he wanted to bring with him would break down very quickly. The professor added that each floor is called a room, and when they defeat the monsters in it or overcome all the traps, the space itself transports the group to the next room. This is called a shift, and the more shifts they experience, the deeper they descend into the tower. Therefore, once they've cleared a room, they can never return to it. Moreover, a new room means different monsters, stronger than the previous ones, and similar traps. Dokyeon also had a question for the professor, but it wasn't quite the same as Yuan's. She asked what would happen if one of the students died while climbing the tower. Yuan and E-Slide were very surprised, as they had already forgotten that it was possible to die in battle right inside the tower. Yumina noted that this was a very important question, and it was good that they had asked. But contrary to their fears, in most areas of the tower, test subjects don't actually die, even if they are killed. To be more precise, if someone dies, they're simply sent back to the tower's entrance. At the same time, thanks to the student ID card, which records their progress, they won't have to start from the very beginning. When they re-enter, they'll pick up right where they left off. S-Light surmised that since they can be revived, they can keep trying as many times as they want. However, Dokdeon had additional questions about this. Humanist said that, in most areas, test subjects don't die, which means there are places where they can die. In that case, the tower does not guarantee their complete safety. The professor noticed Dokyeon's keen observation and replied that this was indeed the case. In some cases, they might indeed face real death. But that didn't stop the students from setting out to climb the tower. The first monster in their path was the Clow-Sighter, a notorious monster that devours all of a researcher's equipment. But thanks to the students' skills and strength, defeating it was no trouble at all. While the others were fighting, Yu-Wan was lost in thought. He had discovered the concept of fire, but he couldn't seem to extract it. He hadn't had this problem in the dungeons, so the young man wondered why he couldn't do it in the tower. Understanding the reason might hold the key to unlocking the boy's abilities. Meanwhile, Dokyeon approached him to ask if he'd managed to figure anything out. Yu-Wan tried to extinguish the flame, but it didn't work. Dokyeon replied that it was a shame, because if it had worked, they could have taken advantage of the unique features of each location in the tower. Suddenly, a huge Clow-Sighter appeared behind the girl, intent on literally devouring her. But Yu-Wan reacted in time and fended off the threat. To be more precise, it was Eva, who, although she had taken on the primary form of a snake, could still transform into a weapon. So clearing this level of the tower wasn't particularly difficult. Yu-Wan noted that he had even more powerful weapons, but they were a bit noisy. But Dokyeon replied that she doubted his weapons would be noisier than those of Rushel and S-Light. She thought this was ridiculous, since the essence of dungeon combat is to move stealthily, avoiding detection by enemies, rather than just smashing everything in sight. Rushel and S-Light's fighting style was quite different from their usual way of life. In any case, they managed to clear the first room of Clow-Sighters, but they shouldn't let their guard down just yet, because they could sense a powerful concentration of energy nearby. And it looks like a bigger and stronger monster is about to appear. That very elite monster. S-Light wanted to suggest that Yu-Wan use his eyes to locate the target, but at that very moment, Yu-Wan was just about to use them himself. He'd managed to spot something resembling an obelisk that was absorbing a great deal of energy, and it seemed someone was about to emerge from it. Since it was Rushel who possessed that frenzied explosive power, she was the one who rushed toward the obelisk. Her fighting style resembled that of a berserker. It seemed as though she lost control during her attacks and destroyed everything in her path. With a powerful blow, she effortlessly shattered the obelisk, preventing the elite monster from appearing. An enhanced core, a very rare item, formed where the obelisk had stood. After picking it up, Rushel began to change. Yu-Wan was the first to notice it. More precisely, her hair gradually began to darken. At first, Yu-Wan didn't understand what had happened, since the core wasn't supposed to have that effect. Rushel, however, understood the reason and was worried that people wouldn't understand her and would turn away from her. This was a consequence of Rushel's power, a sort of forge of the heart, a concept that uses emotions as fuel, burning them to gain strength. In other words, a berserker. Rushel was terrified that she might have looked too frightening when she was enraged. Yu-Wan replied that wasn't the case at all, and that everything was fine. On the contrary, she looked reliable. But Rushel was still worried that if things got worse, she might lose control. Dokyeon pointed out that everything was indeed fine, and she shouldn't worry. Besides, if she did lose control, Dokyeon would kill her before she could do any harm. These words elicited a mixed reaction from the others. Yu-Wan tried to convince Dokyeon that this wasn't the right thing to do, since they'd have to start their research all over again. But Dokyeon simply replied that the three of them would have to continue conquering the tower together if Rushel kept acting that way. In fact, she would have preferred to be in a group with just him, since the others offered no hope. These words hurt Rushel and disrupted the harmony among the group. But Yu-Wan promised to come up with something and understood why Rushel was so timid. He promised he'd find a solution, since it's the class president's job to find a way out. His words cheered Rushel up, and now she was less worried about what was happening. In her eyes, Yu-Wan looked like a prince, but to S-Light and Dokyeon, it looked strange from the outside. Despite all the conflicts, the students managed to get past one obstacle and head into the second room. The second room wasn't much different from the first, except for the moss and weeds. The core of the elite monster that dropped from the obelisk had many different concepts, such as acid and fusion. Yu-Wan obtained as many concepts from just one room as if he had cleared the Goblin Cave 10 times over. Acid and fusion are attributes capable of dissolving substances. Apparently, they appeared when they defeated the Clown Cider. He imbued his sword with fusion and passed the remaining acid on to Eve. Dokgoyeon crept up on him unnoticed. She, too, was curious to see how Yuan applied these concepts. She also noticed that if he had honed his intuition better, it would have been harder to scare him. At that moment, something strange began to happen in the room. S-Light reminded his friends to take things more seriously, since monsters would soon appear. They needed to be more careful, but Dokgoyeon had a different opinion. To her, the second room seemed no different from the first. No matter how carefree a lion is, can an ant's bite really kill it? Meanwhile, evil spirits appeared in the room, malevolent entities targeting the magic within living beings. Eastlight said that enemies are usually caught off guard precisely when they least expect it. Dokjeon suggested a small idea. How about Yuan going through the room alone? Yuan was surprised, as he didn't understand where such abrupt suggestions were coming from. Rushiel and Eastlight agreed. It was too dangerous. But Dokjeon pointed out that the opposite was true. She explained that he needed to unleash his abilities, especially with the sparring match coming up next week. There was truth in Dokyeon's words, and Yuan didn't deny it. So he agreed to take on this challenge and decided to try clearing the room on his own. S-Light tried to stop him, but Yuan stood his ground. After all, as Dokgoyeon had said, he needed to boost his stats quickly. So it would be a waste if they spent all their energy here. He needed to close the gap between them as quickly as possible. Rushiel and S-Light decided to trust him after all, but if anything went wrong, they would rush to his aid immediately. Yuan also asked Dokgoyeon if she would help him if he got exhausted. She replied that, at the very least, she promised he wouldn't die from overexertion. That was exactly what he wanted to hear from her. And now it was time to show what he was capable of. And his living artifact, which is essentially his primary weapon, would help him with that. He had transformed it into a real automatic weapon, which he had already used while exploring dungeons. With such a weapon, fighting through Yuan's evil spirits was no trouble at all. Not a trace of the monsters remained. The bullets seemed to burn right through them. Rushiel and S-Light were surprised, as they had never seen Yuan's power before. Could this really be an ordinary weapon from Yuan's world? The speed with which he defeated the monsters was simply astonishing. S-Light thought that if the soldiers of their countries possessed such weapons, everything would change. His weapon resembled a rapid-fire launcher, but it fired metal pellets. With a weapon like that, he could handle third-class assassins, and perhaps even second-class ones. Such a weapon is useful even in the world of martial arts. However, this style of attack is too straightforward. It's good at long range, but at close range, the main drawback of such an attack was that, in such a confined space, he could easily be surrounded. Enemies can easily strike from his blind spot, which is exactly what happened to Yuan. S-Light and Rukiel were already about to rush to his aid, but it wasn't necessary. But Yuan had more than just that weapon. It wasn't for nothing that he'd trained in martial arts with Dokyeon, so he easily dealt with the threat that had crept up from behind. The guys were glad he wasn't hurt, and at the same time, surprised when he drew his sword. They hadn't expected him to be so skilled with melee weapons. It was indeed impressive, but Yuan realized that it still wasn't good enough. After all, no matter what, he wasn't yet as good as S-Light or Dokgoyeon. Dokyeon watched with a smile as Yuan mastered the martial arts well after her training sessions. Yuan combined his attacks. While Eva killed the enemies in front, he dealt with those approaching from behind. The adrenaline coursing through his veins was off the charts, and he felt himself growing stronger. As a result, Yuan managed to clear the room on his own. It was exhausting, but not too difficult. One last evil spirit remained. Once it was destroyed, the next shift would occur, so Yuan suggested taking a short break. Meanwhile, his abilities continued to amaze Dokgoyeon. The part of the monster he had cut off was melting and disintegrating, even though he was using skills he had only just mastered in the previous room. How was he able to learn so quickly? S-Light was amazed by Yuan's resourcefulness. After all, not everyone would have thought to control the shift in this way without killing the last monster. Dokgoyeon also praised him, saying it was good work and that the final blow was simply superb. She also added that if only he weren't so focused on quick sword strikes, it would be better. But still, it's better than being just a fool who only has a sword, hinting at S-Light. While S-Light was trying to prove to Dokgoyeon that he was right and that he too had fought bravely, Yuan decided to get a drink. But he was the only one who could enjoy this beautiful and peaceful moment. After all, Yuan had completely forgotten that he was the only one who could afford such a luxury. Yuan was surprised when everyone looked at him with hatred in their eyes. He said he'd bought the drink in town. That was the problem. He was the only one allowed to leave the academy. Yuan made an excuse, saying that even if he wanted to share it, he couldn't because he hadn't bought enough. But that was a lie. Besides, the drink just relieves a little fatigue. But this wasn't the time to think about such things, since they were still inside the tower. Tokyoung wanted to clear the next room on her own. Yuan didn't quite understand why she wanted to clear the next room alone, since Tokyoung had previously said that he was the one who needed to fight in order to become stronger. In reality, she also wanted to try the soda, since she'd never had it before. But in any case, enough sitting around. It was time to move on. After defeating the last monster, a shift began, just as expected. Meanwhile, Yuan had a lot on his mind regarding leveling up his stats. He's already at an intermediate level for the academy. During the time he's spent here, he's only swung his sword a few times. But despite that, his fencing and thrusting, which he had only just begun to master, had already improved. The leveling speed was simply incredible. With such efficiency, he should focus on fencing, since the sparring match is already on Tuesday. It all depends on how much he can improve his martial arts score. After all, the gap between Yuan and Erecto is over 200 points. That's simply unthinkable. Frankly speaking, no matter how hard he tries, Yuan will never be able to bridge that gap in ability over the weekend. But while training with Dokjin, he picked up a small hint for himself. Acquiring abilities is important, but refining them is even more important when it comes to developing martial arts skills. But learning these skills on his own would be quite difficult. Therefore, it would be a huge advantage for Yuan if Tokyoung taught him a couple more techniques. Yuan thought this was wrong, because then he would become dependent on her, and he didn't like that. There's no need to rush. There's still time to think it over. While Yuan was lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice that he and his friends had started falling. S-Light managed to grab hold of the wall and shouted at Yuan to hold on to him, but it was already too late, and he was falling rapidly. Yuan didn't understand what had happened, or why the floor beneath them had suddenly disappeared. But there was no time to think, because he and Rochelle were falling straight toward the ground. And the most terrifying thing was right on the floor. A trap with sharp spikes. Yuan used the artifact, managed to catch Rochelle as she was falling, and grabbed hold of the wall. If he had hesitated even for a second, Rochelle would have landed right on those spikes. Fortunately, at the last moment, Yuan and Rochelle managed to escape. The young man didn't understand what had happened, why the room was so huge, and why there was even a trap on the floor. Yuan thought that perhaps this was a boss room, but then he heard Dokoyan's voice. She stood confidently with her feet right on the ceiling and advised him not to stay in one place for too long. This room is full of traps, so he could easily die here. Suddenly, a trapdoor opened behind Yuan, and arrows flew out of it at breakneck speed. But those weren't the only ones. The traps were like an arsenal, and worst of all, they were razor sharp. The situation had escalated, and Yuan needed to make a decision as quickly as possible and find a way out. It was difficult to dodge because he was holding Rochelle with one hand, and she was on the brink of death. But since things had come to this, the time had come to use his entire arsenal. Using Eve, he managed to dodge the incoming weapons. Then he grabbed Rochelle and summoned his new living artifact, Lilith. It wasn't for nothing that he'd bought such a wonderful hover bike in Ronica. He told Rochelle to hold on tight because the place was full of traps, and it seemed like they were all aimed at them. It seemed as if the room itself was one big trap, since there was a trap set in every corner. It seemed that now was the moment for Yuan to level up his escape skills. But the flying weapons attacked not only Yuan and Rochelle, but others as well. The traps also reacted to S-Light. He used his artifact, which grants him wings, allowing him to fly freely. With the help of the wings granted by the artifact, he managed to fend off the flying threat. Despite this, there was something that kept troubling S-Light. The professor had said that the traps wouldn't appear until the 20th room, but they were already in the 3rd room. So why had the difficulty changed so much? Aslaith was also curious about what artifact Yuan had summoned again. As always, he was amazed by Yuan's quick thinking, and even felt a little envious. Meanwhile, Yuan was doing his best to dodge the attacks. Traps were everywhere, no matter which way they went. At that moment, Rochelle was thinking about the time Yuan had caught her. She thought it was a definite sign from him, and decided to take action as well. Yuan had a completely different opinion, and was surprised by such a sudden change in the situation. But right now, he needed to focus on something more important: survival. The attacks didn't stop, and their supply seemed endless. They were joined by S-Light, who didn't understand why Yuan had suddenly started dodging so poorly, since everything had been fine up until then. But Yuan also had a question: where had Eastlight gotten those wings? Eastlight was also curious about the contraption Yuan was riding. Yuan replied that it was a hover bike he'd bought, and then asked if the three of them were here, where was Dokgoyeon? Eslit replied that he hadn't seen her. Perhaps she'd fallen into a trap. But Yuwon said there was no way she could have been caught so easily. Meanwhile, Dokyeong, dodging the traps, easily avoided them thanks to her agility. Yuwon was certain she was fine, and that she was secretly watching them right now. Eslit wondered when all this would end. Yuwon said that according to the manual, they needed to hold out here for a while, but for how long was unknown. He suggested that Eslit run to the other side while he analyzed the traps. All the traps suddenly locked onto Eslit as he flew by. Yuwon tried to figure out the trap's priority. It seemed that moving objects were the priority. It turned out that all he had to do was stand still, and the traps wouldn't activate. Meanwhile, Rochelle noticed that one of the arrows had, after all, wounded Lilith. Yuwon pulled out the arrow and was about to tell the others that they just needed to stop moving unnecessarily. But in that case, how would they be able to get through the room? Yuwon also noticed something strange. The arrow he had picked up suddenly flared up. Could it be that he had absorbed it and learned its concept? That was strange, since he hadn't been able to learn anything in the first room. What had changed? The young man began to think that the reason must be related to his attributes. Or was it just a coincidence? Yuwon wanted to find out more about this, and the only way to find out if it was true or just a coincidence was to try again. He picked up the sword, and somehow he managed to absorb it after all. Without even realizing it, he had mastered a new concept, even though, in theory, he should have acquired the sword concept. He had acquired the decapitation concept and didn't understand why that one in particular. Come to think of it, this concept was different from what he'd seen before. But at that moment, Eslit began to face very serious problems. He let his guard down, thinking he only needed to watch out for traps. And who would have thought that water would pour out of them too? But it wasn't just water. Most likely, something had been mixed in, because after that, Eslit's senses began to dull, and everything around him blurred. On top of that, he was surrounded by dozens of other traps. If things continued this way, he wouldn't have time to react to the next one. But Yuwon rushed to his aid, realizing the situation Eslit was in. So he left Rochelle and rushed over to Eslit himself. Yuwon explained to her that he was about to do something that was very much like a gamble, and so he didn't want to drag her into it. She was worried about her friend because, knowing him, he would do anything to save the people close to him. Meanwhile, Yuwon began to devise a plan. Learning yet another concept increased the values of acid and wave by 10. Just as Yuwon had expected, and just as it happened before, he touched the water. But what he acquired was not water, but a wave. Now it became clear to him why the concept he had absorbed earlier was decapitation and not sword. At that very moment, Dokyeon, having heard the sounds of water, rushed to their aid. When she got closer, she was surprised to see what Yuwon was doing and didn't understand what he was up to. Meanwhile, he continued to rush faster and faster. Along the way, he realized something. The state of a substance in a specific form at a given moment determines which concept can be acquired. Those projectiles were aimed at his neck, which is why they carried the concept of decapitation rather than sword. So now he understood how to fend off all the attacks and save Eslit. The deeper Yuwon's all-seeing gaze became, the further beyond the limits of existence he could penetrate. Eslit was utterly astonished when he saw Yuwon flying past him. It seemed as though he was flying straight toward the traps hurtling toward him. Yuwon was certain that in order to deflect the projectiles, he needed to understand their intentions. After all, his power lies in concepts, and the more he understands them, the stronger he becomes. Therefore, Yuwon's power depends entirely on himself. He rose high into the air to become the primary target for the projectiles. By doing so, he hoped to read them. Eslit was baffled, because it all looked as if Yuwon, having lost hope, was simply heading straight into a trap. Meanwhile, Yuwon continued to think about the best course of action. He realized that he didn't need to absorb all the concepts. It would be enough to simply keep combining them as long as he could, and then break them down into parts. That would be more than enough to destroy all the projectiles and move on to the next room. And Yuwon's plan succeeded. He managed to save Eslit and eliminate all the incoming projectiles. Watching this from the sidelines, Rochelle realized she'd made the right choice in trusting Yuwon. Eslit was the one who worried about him the most, so the first thing he did was ask if his friend was okay. Yuwon said everything was great, and he was glad that Eslit was okay. Eslit was curious to know what it was. He replied that he wasn't entirely sure yet, but it looked as if everything that had been flying toward them had merged into a single entity. It felt as if he had received something amazing. S-Light thought that perhaps Yuan had awakened a new ability that allowed him to interact directly with the traps. Suddenly, several more traps reacted, firing projectiles straight at the group. Caught off guard, the boys didn't even have time to react properly. But just then, Rushel and Dokyeon appeared and effortlessly deflected the projectiles. To Yuan, it looked impressive, but S-Light was more surprised by Dokyeon's appearance, since he thought she was already stuck in one of the traps. They managed to get through the third room and move on to the next one. A minor conflict broke out again between Dokyeon and S-Light. She called him reckless since he'd let his guard down again and gotten himself into trouble, while S-Light considered this a very rude way to treat someone who'd nearly died. Yuan simply watched from the sidelines, noting how well the two got along, in his opinion. Be that as it may, when danger strikes, they rush in to help everyone. Isn't that proof of effective teamwork? But Dokyeon replied that she had simply been biding her time, because once she had made a debtor, she would collect the debt when she needed to. Yuan hoped that this sense of camaraderie wasn't just an illusion, and in the meantime, they moved on to the fourth room. At first glance, it posed no threat, and there were no traps in sight. But this room had a different peculiarity. It was filled with monsters. Yuan was confident that dealing with them would be a piece of cake for him. He used his usual artifact, transforming it into a firearm, but he couldn't even scratch an enemy. This room contained tower spiders, unique monsters that can appear on any floor of the tower, regardless of level. S-Light also added that their stats are random and do not depend on the floor. It looked like Yuan wouldn't be able to handle everything on his own this time. They'd have to work together. Yuan wasn't happy with this turn of events. He found it hard to believe that such powerful monsters had already appeared in the fourth room. But Dokyeon asked them not to interfere. She wanted to show Yuan something, so he should watch more closely. She used her wind burst technique, concentrating a powerful stream of energy, and she unleashed the energy like a beam. This was exactly what Yuan had been looking for. Dokyeon effortlessly destroys the enemy standing in the path of the energy beam. Yuan was surprised yet again to see just how powerful Dokyeon was. The spiders didn't stand a chance of dodging or withstanding such an attack, so most of them were knocked out. Dokyeon suggested leaving them to Yuan to deal with. She called herself the most merciful ruler they could ever hope to see. Although Yuan had heard similar words from her before, it made him uneasy every time. But that wasn't so important. The more pressing goal now was to destroy all their enemies. Yuan drew his sword and advanced toward the spiders. After what Dokyeon had shown him, he felt more confident. It seemed that now he would be able to defeat such a powerful enemy. And the others were extremely surprised when they saw this. The spiders' bodies were so hard that the young man couldn't even cut through them with his sword. The monster didn't sit idly by either and launched a counterattack. Leaping into the air, it lunged at Yuan. But this was the perfect opportunity for Yuan to retreat slightly. Then he destroyed the spider with a piercing strike that Dokyeon had taught him. The others were also glad that Yuan managed to cut the monster in half, but still, it was pretty pointless if he couldn't cut them down all at once. Yuan can't keep striking and retreating when there are so many of them around. He'll just walk right into their trap. And yet, he's not just a boy with a sword. First and foremost, his special ability is concepts. And from the previous room, he'd acquired 20 destruction concepts. Now, more than ever, is the time to test their compatibility with the sword. And it worked. His artifact sword evolved thanks to its excellent compatibility with its wielder. Now it's the Executioner's longsword with devastating stats. From now on, it will be no trouble for Yuan to cut down a couple of spiders at once. The time had come for the young man to test his new sword and demonstrate his strength. And he succeeded. He effortlessly sliced through several spiders at once, creatures he hadn't even been able to scratch before. The boys were simply thrilled with the young man and how quickly he was growing stronger. But this aroused even greater interest in Dokyeon. Yuan was also surprised by his own strike. He managed to land a clean blow, but the feeling was completely different, as if he'd swung too hard. It seemed he still had a lot of practice ahead of him with his new sword. There were too many spiders, so S-Light and Rukio rushed to help Yuan. Dokyeon, meanwhile, stood off to the side, pondering how Yuan had become so strong in the blink of an eye. She was amazed at how he managed to cut through enemies he couldn't even touch. It was the first time she had seen someone capable of such intuitive and unstoppable abilities. He hones his skills without relying solely on brute force, and that was truly astonishing. After all, usually when someone enhances their weapon or finds a better one, they end up swinging it around like a fool. but he was completely free of that flaw. Even if not right now, one day he would grasp the true essence of the piercing strike on his own. That's why Do-kyun saw no point in intervening. However, wouldn't it be a waste if she just left things as they were? After overcoming the three calamities, Do-kyun took pride in being called the greatest genius in the world of martial arts. And now she was simply standing there, watching a man whose talent made her past seem pitiful. This state of affairs did not please Do-kyun very much, and it led her to certain thoughts. That's why she wanted to make Yoo-won her own, so that he would fight on her side. Although Do-kyun hadn't said this out loud, it was as if Yoo-won had heard everything. It sent shivers down his spine. Yoo-won thought the boss was about to show up. Yoo-won asked Do-kyun why she was just standing there doing nothing. Didn't she want the soda he bought in town? Do-kyun really wanted it, but she thought Yoo-won really only had one can of soda. But that was a lie. Meanwhile, all the students received a message. Something like this happened very rarely. Not only did they receive it, but so did all the other students at the academy who were in the tower. But the message's content was alarming. It stated that all participants must immediately leave the tower, as ordered by the rector himself. Meanwhile, Rushel noticed a strange aura of movement. But Do-kyun kept saying she didn't want to fight because Yoo-won hadn't given her a drink. But Rushel told them that enemies were approaching, so they needed to get ready. Meanwhile, portals appeared, and countless spiders crawled out of them. S-Light surmised that this was exactly what the professor had told them about at that meeting. The student crystal wasn't working either. The group had truly found themselves in a deadly trap. It seemed they were in a situation where even students could die. The monsters began rushing in droves straight toward the young students. There were so many of them that it seemed they could simply overwhelm the students. It was an incredibly difficult situation, and the most terrifying part of it all was that this was only the beginning. The professor had mentioned something about the likelihood of an invasion by space pirates when new students climb the tower. The problem is that their anomalous invasion leads to the emergence of an unpredictable phenomenon: irregularities. And as a rule, students don't die during a normal run, but as soon as things get unusual, everything changes. The rules inside the tower are turned upside down. Safe zones become dangerous. At the same time, the number of monsters grows uncontrollably, as if someone were endlessly spawning them. On top of all this, the difficulty level of the rooms fluctuates unpredictably. At the same time, a host of other problems begin to arise, such as traps. Therefore, the tower cannot guarantee your safety. You need to keep these things in mind. So if they realize they've encountered the phenomenon of irregularity, they need to know that this is indeed a very dangerous situation. So the best solution in this situation is to run as fast as possible in the hope of finding a way out. Or find a more spacious area so the monsters don't corner them. There were an absolutely terrifying number of spiders, so the group decided to move to a more spacious area. Rushel was already beside herself with rage, particularly because of the nature of her abilities. It seemed as though there weren't just a lot of spiders, there were an endless number of them. Do-kyun tried to deal with them using gusts of wind. S-Light continued to attack alongside her, but there were simply too many monsters. At least Do-kyun and S-Light were able to put up a fight. Rushel wasn't standing idly by either. She was slicing through the monsters at an incredible speed, causing her hair to grow even darker. She wasn't even saying anything anymore, and if her hair changed completely, she would most likely lose her composure. That would be a nightmare scenario, so Yoo-won didn't want to let that happen. Do-kyun also noticed that Rushel had changed drastically and had completely lost her mind. She too couldn't keep going at this pace. If she didn't make the transition soon, the situation would become even more dangerous. Yoo-won took the very drink from his inventory that helps relieve fatigue a little and gave it to Do-kyun. For now, he would hold off the spiders, and in the meantime, she could rest and finish her soda. The girl was glad that she would finally be able to try this miracle drink. Still, she wondered if Yoo-won would really be able to handle such a crowd. But Yoo-won already had a little plan, so he was full of confidence. And since there really were so many spiders, it would be very difficult to kill them with a sword. He needed a more powerful weapon, like, for example, a grenade. The explosion was simply massive, as if it weren't just one small grenade, but an entire bomb. Some of the spiders were blown to pieces, while the rest continued to burn. S-Light was thrilled with Yoo-won. He had once again demonstrated something new and amazing using his power. Yoo-won told him to rest, while he himself would finish off some of the spiders with his sword. S-Light and Do-kyun were already a little tired, but Rushel still had plenty of energy left. However, she couldn't be relied upon because she was too unpredictable. Therefore, letting S-Light and Do-kyun rest was the best decision. Suddenly, a notification window popped up for Yoo-won. stating that the blood poison of his sword had been increased to 15. He didn't understand why this had happened, but the window stated that it was because he had vaguely grasped the concept of a cleaving strike and acquired it. His depth of understanding had reached 2 units. The sword changed from its usual color to red and became even stronger. Yuan didn't fully understand how the blood poison effect worked, and when, if not now, would he be able to find out for sure. Yuan continued to slice up the spiders with incredible speed and force, not giving them even the slightest chance to get close to him. After all, a hoverbike isn't just for getting around the city, but Yuan noticed something strange. The trajectory of his sword had also widened. It seemed that while a cleaving strike amplified the power of dismemberment, the blood poison extended the range and distance of the attack. But on the downside, to do this, the sword uses its owner's blood. Therefore, Yuan wouldn't be able to use it too often. It felt as if with every swing, he were giving a blood sample. S-Light was curious about what Yuan was up to again, and what kind of strange aura his sword had. Meanwhile, Rochelle continued to wreak havoc among the spiders. Yuan noted that the others shouldn't intervene until they'd rested enough. But S-Light replied that he'd already rested enough, and that Yuan had better take a look around. The swarm of spiders, which had seemed endless, had noticeably diminished. Of course, the group had killed a significant portion of them, but it still seemed more as though the stream of monsters had suddenly stopped. Perhaps the battle was over, or, on the contrary, because something like a boss was about to appear. Meanwhile, Rochelle had completely lost control of herself and her actions. Suddenly, another portal appeared, and out of it emerged the room's boss, which was significantly different from the previous spiders. Yuan didn't understand why an elite boss had appeared on their floor, since they usually start in room 50. But then S-Light noticed something even more terrifying and told Yuan to look at it. Turning around, Yuan was beside himself with surprise. Usually only one elite boss appears, but they had 2 of them. The situation couldn't get any worse. It seemed like the trap room had been nothing but a walk in the park. An elite boss both in front and behind them. And to make matters worse, the student crystals aren't working, so if they die, it'll be for good. While the others were fussing about and wondering what to do, Rochelle had already rushed into battle. It didn't matter to her who her opponent was. Her main goal was to defeat him. Yuan suggested they split up. He and Dokyeon would take on one boss, while S-Light should stay closer to Rochelle. That way, they'd have a better chance of defeating the monsters. S-Light rushed to Rochelle's aid, even though she didn't really need his help. Meanwhile, Yuan began to think about how to defeat the boss. He used a cleaving strike and blood poison to hack at the spiders, but would he be able to pull it off against such a colossus? Meanwhile, Dokyeon continued to calmly finish her soda. Yuan knew he couldn't handle it alone, but he refused to ask Dokyeon for help, so she couldn't tell if it was pride or stubbornness. Nevertheless, she liked the soda, and the taste was quite unusual. So from now on, he would repay his debt to Dokyeon with soda. Meanwhile, Dokyeon had already drawn her sword for the first time ever. Yuan didn't understand why she needed a sword, since she could handle things even with her bare hands. He thought she wanted to show him some special move, but Dokyeon replied that she simply didn't want to get her hands dirty. Nevertheless, she wanted to hint to Yuan what he was missing to complete his strike. She would demonstrate it only once, but that single strike should be enough for him to figure it out. So Dokyeon told Yuan to watch more closely and focus on what he saw. But just at that moment, Yuan looked away upon hearing S-Light's screams. At that moment, Rochelle attacked him, mistaking him for a monster. Meanwhile, the spider fired something at them that looked like a web, but was more like slime. Rochelle managed to dodge it, but S-Light was completely engulfed by the substance. The monster, it seemed, hadn't expected her to dodge its attack either. This made Rochelle even more furious. All her hair turned dark, and she completely lost control. Now it looked like a battle between 2 monsters, rather than a student fighting an elite boss. Dokyeon tells him once again not to lose focus and to keep his eyes on her. After all, she'll only perform this move once, so he'd better remember it. With a powerful slashing strike, Dokyeon splits the seemingly invincible monster in 2. It was just a swing of the sword, a simple motion, a slash from bottom to top. In this extremely simple movement, Yuan saw death dividing the world. After that, a notification window appeared for Yuan, indicating that he had instantly begun to grasp advanced techniques and, along with that, increased his control power. Furthermore, the depth of his understanding of what he saw, heard, and was told increased by 5 units. On top of that, the young man managed to grasp a fragment of a very powerful and complex martial arts concept. Many of his concepts expanded several-fold. Just by catching a glimpse of a fraction of her martial arts skills, Yuan's internal code was advancing at an incredible rate, a power similar to that with which Dokgoyan shattered Ortima's force field. Perhaps an enhanced version of that move that breaks through the power of death was unleashed at that moment. Yuan thought, can a human really imbue his sword with such willpower? The concept of death he had studied earlier became so vivid and clear that it sent chills down his spine. Yuan lost his focus for a moment and felt as if he had fallen out of the world. But Dokgoyan quickly snapped him back to his senses. She also handed him the core that had fallen from the spider. The core contained many concepts, and yet, would it be right for him to take it, since it was Dokgoyan who had defeated the boss? But she replied that it was fine. It was his reward, so he could go ahead and take it. Meanwhile, S-Light was still stuck in the slime and couldn't get out, so he asked the others to help him. On top of that, right now, Rushel is descending into complete madness. In this situation, S-Light seemed completely useless. And if Yuan intervenes in the fight with Rushel, it seems he'll be gone in a second. So in this situation, the only one who can stop the crazed Rushel is Dokgoyan. After all, out of the three of them, she's the strongest and feels no pity for Rushel. But she didn't really want to stop her, since she had already done her part. For some reason, Yuan thought that Dokgoyan wouldn't like it if one of them died in such an unusual situation, and who knows what would happen after that. Meanwhile, the spider still seemed capable of fighting and was slowly getting back to its feet. Still, Dokgoyan agreed to try to stop Rushel, but in exchange, Yuan had to finish off the boss on his own. Dokgoyan used gusts of wind to provoke Rushel into attacking her. She wanted the frenzied girl to come down to her, but Yuan didn't understand why she would do that. However, it seems she had her own way of calming Rushel down. The furious Rushel jumped off the spider and lunged straight at Dokgoyan. It seemed as though she could have reduced her to dust if Dokgoyan hadn't managed to dodge her leap in time. And yet, dodging Rushel's chaotic attacks was no trouble at all for Dokgoyan. The difference between them wasn't just a matter of strength. Rushel attacked haphazardly, so it was easy for Dokgoyan to counterattack. And yet, even after such a desperate leap, Rushel didn't give up. On the contrary, she became even more furious, her anger toward Dokgoyan growing with every passing moment. Yuan was surprised at how Dokgoyan managed to handle her. From the outside, it really looked as if she was just having fun. But the young man didn't have time to be distracted by that, since he had his own work to do. His task was to defeat the elite boss, and it seemed Yuan wasn't sure he could pull it off. But Dokgoyan assured him that if he had properly memorized the move she'd shown him, he should easily be able to defeat the monster. Yuan was plagued by doubts about this. Meanwhile, the spider attacked him first, without waiting for Yuan to make a move. Yuan didn't understand what was going on. Why had it pounced at the very moment when everyone had backed away from him? After all, it was on the brink of death. Could the boss really still think he could handle the enemy? But the young man didn't just stand by either. He decided to attack the spider in return. He used Eva to bind the spider and immobilize it. And it worked. The others were surprised when Yuan managed to bind the spider so easily. Meanwhile, he continued to attack it with his sword. Thanks to Eva, he had immobilized the boss as much as possible. Next, Yuan planned to use a slashing strike with blood poison to strike the moment the spider reached the limits of its range. But his plan didn't work out as he'd hoped. Yuan failed to cut the spider in half. To kill the spider, Yuan needed to cut off its head. Only then could he kill it. Yuan didn't understand why it hadn't worked. Could it be that his slashing strike was too short? However, there was something else. The blood poison hadn't activated properly. Given this, it made sense to use the two abilities in sequence. Yuan had done something similar once before, but at that moment, Yuan ran into trouble. The spider managed to break the chains binding him. It attacked him just when the young man least expected it. The others began to worry about him. Would he really be able to defeat the monster? Yuan managed to survive by blocking the enemy's attack. But it was so intense and unexpected that for a second, he thought he wouldn't be able to block the blow. As soon as its paw touched the blade of the sword, Yuan managed to change his angle and parry the blow. If he had taken the attack head-on, the sword and his hand would surely have been shattered into pieces. And yet, he didn't understand how he'd managed to sense it. It was just a split second, but it felt like an eternity. Perhaps it was because he had previously seen Dokgoyan's sword technique. In the process of parrying the attack, he managed to grasp and master the concept of flow. His depth of understanding of flow reached 5 units. Yuan would never have imagined that what he had seen could awaken the dark essence of martial arts within him. An essence that had been slumbering deep inside. Something he hadn't even suspected existed. Even if he couldn't replicate Dokgoyan's sword technique exactly, he had a backup plan. The battle between the spider and Yuan continued, but so far, the monster had the upper hand. Meanwhile, S-Light began to wonder what exactly Yuan was trying to do. There is a concept known as parrying, a movement that blocks or deflects an opponent's strike to the side. It can thwart an attack or prevent a fatal wound, and if executed successfully, one can even counterattack the opponent. However, this is merely a tactical concept, not reality. In reality, it's quite easy to die before you master such a skill. What must happen will happen, and yet S-Light couldn't stop thinking about it. How could Yuan even attempt to master the technique in such a critical situation? Is it even possible to master a parrying technique under such conditions? Yuan tried to deflect the strike at the moment of the attack, redirecting it in another direction, and he managed to do it. Little by little, he's beginning to see and anticipate his opponent's attacks. Meanwhile, Rochelle wouldn't let up and continued to attack Dokyeon. Her attempts to strike him were so ridiculous that Dokyeon only had to stick out his leg for her to fall to the ground. And yet, Dokyeon knew that Yuan would be able to draw some conclusions from that first strike. But she never imagined he would demonstrate something so unexpected. A fighting technique that embodies the essence of the flow exists in the Central Plains. Few have attempted to master it, redirecting an opponent's attack in 100,000th of a second. This technique requires incredible reaction speed, and it seems Yuan is starting to get the hang of it. Mastering it involves too much risk and excessive effort. Most people prefer simpler methods, such as ES-Light. For someone like Dokyeon, who has always specialized in martial arts aimed at destruction, Yuan forces her to see things in a new light. She never imagined that something so insignificant and meaningless, considered a mere trick, would turn out to be surprisingly profound. But you can't win a battle just by deflecting attacks. To win, you have to go beyond the limits. Now that he's gone this far, it's interesting to see what Yuan will do if he's managed to master the flow to deflect his opponent's power. Will Yuan be able to use this to launch a counterattack? And now is the moment for Yuan to show what he has been able to grasp in this short time. By using his piercing power and dodging attacks, while also utilizing his second ability, Yuan managed to land a blow. This time, Yuan managed to pierce the elite boss and cleave off its head. Dokyeon was so happy, it was as if she had killed a boss for the very first time. Yuan had managed to master a new technique in such a short time, and in such a critical situation at that, and as a result, he had defeated the elite boss. He had done it. On top of that, he was able to unlock another, even more powerful concept by temporarily connecting the concepts within his body to an external concept. Significant changes are now taking place within Yuan. Now that Yuan had defeated the boss, it would be a good idea to help S-Light escape and also reassure Rochelle. But the young man felt that they were relying too heavily on someone who had barely managed to defeat the boss. Still, he had an idea for how to bring Rochelle back to her normal life. He absorbed the concept of the web that S-Light had been trapped in. Then he fed it to Eve, endowing her with an even newer and more powerful ability. After that, he managed to create a magical chain net, yet another artifact. This net can already be used to capture Rochelle, since it also drains magic. This way, she'll at least be immobilized, and over time, she should return to her normal state. And fortunately, everything worked out. Rochelle returned to her normal state as if nothing had happened. Even the student crystal lit up again, which meant it was time to leave the tower. But suddenly, another portal opened nearby. An unknown voice came from it, saying that they had passed the test. They didn't understand who it was or what the voice was, but it kept saying something about a reward. Suddenly, someone began to emerge from the portal, still talking about something. She held out her hand to them and said she was giving them a chance to make a pact with the Thousand-Eyed Watcher. Meanwhile, the professor was eagerly awaiting the students' return. Most of them had already returned, but her class was still missing, and that worried her. But suddenly, a portal appeared right in front of her, and the students emerged from it. All four of them had managed to make it out of the tower safely. The professor was glad to see them together and unharmed, and the first thing she asked was whether the children were all right. She was genuinely worried, since there had been a notice to evacuate the tower, but no one had shown up. She also asked if the kids had managed to clear the area and what had happened inside, but no one wanted to go into detail about what had happened. They moved a short distance away from where many other students were gathered so they could continue their conversation without prying ears. Yuan told the professor that after their fourth descent, they had been taken by surprise by an unusual room. Very little time had passed since they'd entered it. So he asked what had happened on the other side when they'd entered the tower. The professor wasn't particularly eager to talk about it, but she had to explain anyway. The thing is, one of the students had been killed by intruders inside the tower. The academy is currently trying to resolve the situation, but the students who were in the same group as the victim are having a very hard time coping with it. She reminded them of those very same spatial pirates who target newcomers, and that if they kill a student and take his student ID, he'll never be able to respawn and will be stuck in the tower forever. Yuan asked Yumina what had happened to the attacker and whether they had managed to catch him, but she replied that they lost track of him, and the students who were there at the time hadn't been able to stop him. Yan noted that this looked like something planned, not just a coincidence. Even if someone is a student at the academy, there are plenty of intruders intent on climbing the Tower of Babel. Yan continued, saying that for them, the newcomers entering the tower represent a golden opportunity. By passing the entrance exam to the Great Academy and killing a newly admitted freshman, you undermine the academy's reputation, but you earn the title of Conqueror of the Tower and even the coveted student ID. So, the Academy's stance is clear. By saying that the attack by these assailants is a trial that must be overcome, she completely absolves herself of responsibility. The professor was upset to hear such conclusions from Dokyeon, but Dokyeon continued, saying that it seemed the United Academy was exactly that kind of place. Just imagine, there are people who brazenly invade the tower, the very tower that defines the student's purpose in life, yet is unable to protect them from being killed. Isn't that ridiculous for an institution that claims to be the greatest of all dimensions? Yumina simply replied that there's a reason for everything, and that the academy has an obligation to protect its students. However, as soon as they are inside the tower, that obligation becomes their responsibility. Moreover, if the tower has chosen an attacker instead of a student, the academy cannot intervene. Since it is the tower's will, it cannot be defied. Upon hearing this, Dokyeon simply replied that if that were truly the case, this place would become even more unpleasant for her. Dokyeon decided to leave to think things over alone. The professor tried to stop her, but Yuan told her to try to understand Dokyeon, since something disturbing had happened inside the tower. Yuan admitted that, aside from traps and monsters, there was something else in the tower. He noted that before leaving the tower, they had encountered the constellation. The professor was extremely surprised to hear this from Yuan. The fact is that the constellations are transcendent guardians, or simply observers. They watch over countless dimensions, and when they find someone they wish to favor, they enter into a contract with that person. These are transcendent beings who exert influence over a dimension. Constellations grant powerful magic, special abilities, artifacts, and much more to make others follow them. They demand a great deal in return, but even so, few refuse to enter into a contract with them. Above all, in a world where power is prized, there is nothing sweeter than their offer. The constellations are undeniably attractive partners. Yuan added that a strange voice, the observer of all landmarks, had spoken to him. The constellation promised power in exchange for fulfilling its demands. And although Yuan said this with a sense of fear, the professor, on the contrary, was delighted, since they now had the opportunity to make contact with the constellation on their very first day in the tower. For the first time in the Academy's history, establishing contact with the constellation so soon meant that their talents had already been recognized. But the students had a completely different opinion on the matter. Yuan asked the professor if this was all serious, and she replied with complete confidence that it was. The young man asked what the Academy's stance was regarding contracts with constellations. The professor replied that, officially, the Academy maintains a neutral stance. But if the opportunity arises, students are encouraged to take advantage of it. Yuan realized that the Academy was actually encouraging students to sign these contracts, rather than remaining neutral. The young man was surprised that a place like the Academy offered no protection against malefactors, yet housed creatures about which so little was known. The professor asked what exactly the observer had asked him to do. Yuan replied that in exchange for her power, she demanded a murder. Yumina asked Yuan to clarify what he meant by that. He added that she had promised to enter into a contract with whichever two of them killed the other two first. Such was the constellation's requirement for concluding the contract. The constellation said that only warm, blood-filled veins would bring her songs and praise. And they were children with incredible potential, which is why she wanted them to kill their comrade and give her his blood. Only then would she accept them as direct descendants of her lineage. Until they reached the top of this tower and obtained what they desired, her love would never leave them. And she wanted to start right now. Yuan immediately thought this was madness. Someone demanding they kill a friend just to gain power. Utter nonsense. Dokyeon, on the other hand, stepped forward and seemed to want to speak with the constellation. At that moment, she didn't seem like herself. It was as if her darkest side had come to the surface. Yumina speculated that Dokyeon must have released her energy. Yuan replied that was exactly it. She was the one who made the constellation disappear. Yuan added that it was a creature they couldn't even comprehend, one that treated their lives like toys, and that facing such a trial was disgusting. Due to the situation, the tower's entrance would be closed until the end of the week. This wasn't good news for Yuan, since he had a sparring match with Erecto coming up on Tuesday, so he could only spend the remaining time training. Yuan was also thinking about writing a report on what happened in the tower, using footage from their camera, and asked if the professor would mind. She replied that it was fine and that she'd also like to discuss it in more detail over a light meal with everyone. But it seemed that wasn't possible for now. Yuan agreed, noting that after such a turn of events, everyone was a bit physically and mentally exhausted. The professor was concerned for the students and treated them with understanding. She added that they had all done an excellent job and that she was proud of them. Yumina will do everything she can to ensure nothing like this happens next week, and she hopes none of them will think badly of the academy. Light and Rushel thanked the professor and decided to go to their rooms. But Yumina asked Yuan to stay a little longer if it wasn't too much trouble for him. The professor had another personal question for him, so she wanted to ask him directly. Yumina asked if it was true that the constellation hadn't simply promised a contract to 2 out of the 4, but had specifically chosen him and Dokgoyan. Yuan was struck by the professor's insight and replied that that was exactly the case. It wasn't just an attempt to pit them against each other. It was more like sifting gold from sand. The constellation said that Dokgoyan and Yuan would undoubtedly reach the top, but only if they got rid of Light and Rushel. She called them her beloved children and ordered them to kill their friends. Then she promised that they would be ahead of everyone else, and that only those with the brightest potential would remain. Kill and conquer. That is real life, according to the constellation. Upon returning to the room, Yuan saw a dejected Light sitting with his knees drawn up. He tried to lighten the mood by asking him what he thought of the other kids' abilities in the tower. But Light thought Yuan was teasing him for sitting in an unmanly way. Yuan replied that wasn't the case. He hadn't even thought about it. Light apologized to him, saying he just needed to let off some steam, and that he wouldn't mind if Yuan scolded him for it. Yuan replied that he hadn't planned to, but Light took it as yet another taunt, and said he wasn't even worth being insulted. Yuan didn't understand why Light was acting this way, or where all his pride had gone. And suddenly, Light told Yuan that he sort of hated him. The young man wanted to reply that he hated him too, but thought about the consequences that would follow. So he decided to hold back so as not to start another conflict. The atmosphere in the room was tense. After their trip to the tower, the relationship between the two had deteriorated. Yuan asked Light to tell him what was bothering him. Even if it was just a complaint, he would listen to everything. Light said that in the world he came from, he had been one of the greatest talents. And that wasn't an exaggeration or wishful thinking. His family, his servants, absolutely everyone recognized and praised his talent. He was their hope for salvation. They also entrusted him with the sacred sword. And it wasn't just flattery. It was to grant him the power of the Tower of Babel and make him the last guardian to save them. Thanks to everyone believing in him, he was able to make a contract with the sacred sword and came to the academy with a burden of expectations from everyone. But what happened in the end? No matter what Light did, he became a burden to everyone. He was not considered a warrior and was treated as some kind of weakling. Yuan told Light that she shouldn't take the constellation's words seriously because she was talking complete nonsense back then. But Light had a different opinion, because it was Yuan and Dokgoyan that the constellation chose as potential talents, and he and Rushel as worthless. Light repeated the professor's words that the constellations were transcendental beings, much stronger and smarter than people. And he didn't understand how Yuan and Dokgoyan had so easily refused to sign a contract with them. His words shocked Yuan, because he certainly didn't expect to hear something like that from Light. He replied that such a proposal obviously made no sense to him. There were plenty of other ways to become strong without someone having to die, and neither he nor Light had come here to hear that. Light insisted, saying that Yuan only thought that way because he had unrivaled talent, and perhaps if something had to be sacrificed to be chosen by the constellation, Light would hardly have been able to refuse as decisively as Yuan and Dokgoyan. He might not have been able to make the same choice, but he would most likely have accepted her proposal. This made Light feel frustrated, scared, and unable to forgive himself. After such a cold dialogue, Yuan decided to go take a warm shower. When he returned to the room, Light was already in his bed, and Yuan thought that he had already fallen asleep. But Light still had something to add. He apologized to him for his whining. It wasn't Yuan's fault. Light was just a little jealous of him, and he apologized again for burdening him with uncomfortable stories. But Yuan just smiled and said that everything was fine. After all, despite all the feud and the struggle for supremacy, they are ultimately friends. His words touched S-Light, and he felt even more ashamed of what he had said earlier. Yuan also added that he was always ready to listen to his stories. For now, he'd step out for a bit and left him a mug of hot chocolate. If he wanted it, he could have it. Finally, he said that the things you dislike the most are forgotten when you eat something delicious. Yuan was surprised to see how much S-Light had changed since their first meeting, so he should be more careful with his words next time. Meanwhile, Dokoyan had crept up on him unnoticed. Tokoyan was glad to see that Yuan had left the room on his own, and she wouldn't have to go in there. Yuan was surprised to see her. After all, this was a male dormitory, and she definitely couldn't be here. But Dokoyan only answered him, "Not caught, not a thief." And she replied that he was right. This was not the best place for conversation. Dokoyan said that she found herself here while wandering around nearby, so she decided to come in. She was curious how the dead weight was doing, and if everything was okay with it. By dead weight, she meant S-Light. After all, according to her, all he knew was how to swing a sword. Pathetic, talentless, and even less adaptable. But Yuan disagreed. He had talent, and he was skilled in swordsmanship. Dokoyan said that all of this comes from his sword. That's the problem. And Yuan himself understands this very well. His strong body, keen fighting instincts, and special abilities, all thanks to the sword. Without it, Dokoyan believed, he would be indistinguishable from a useless fool. Moreover, he can't even figure out what's going on, is deeply unsure of himself, and at crucial moments, he gets confused, turning into a fool. Yuan realized that listing S-Light's shortcomings could drag on, so he asked her to stop, but she continued, adding that in a serious situation, if he lost his composure and spirit, it would all be over. At this rate, he will let down everyone who is nearby. Even Rushel already feels weak, and if S-Light takes the same position, it will lead to bad consequences. Yuan didn't understand what Dokoyan ultimately wanted, to insult S-Light, or was he still worried about him? So he asked her what about her, how she was feeling after what happened. She too had been acting strange since meeting the constellation, and was irritable in the professor's presence. She's definitely fine. Dokoyan was a little embarrassed that Yuan was worried about her. She even thought that he found out about it with his demon eyes ability. But Yuan replied that he didn't need to use anything to understand. It was all written on her face. He just asked if she was okay, since he was also her friend. But Dokoyan took it as a simple consolation. She thanked him for his concern and replied that it was nothing serious. She was just a little irritated. Yuan asked why. Was it because of the word constellations? She admitted that was exactly it. Perhaps she was thinking the same thing as the constellation. Yuan, of course, understood that Dokoyan was different from others. But hearing this from her directly, he was surprised. At that moment, Dokoyan was actually thinking about getting rid of S-Light and Rushel. Yuan didn't understand what kind of nonsense she was talking about, but Dokoyan continued. Perhaps that was why she was even more disappointed. If she had been more decisive and guided only by the idea of leaving the most capable ones around, completely absorbed, she would have killed them. And even if not with her own hands, she would have created the right conditions for it. At the same moment, she was angry at herself for the fact that she could agree to such a thing. For Yuan, each conversation was more difficult than the other. He seemed to have begun to better understand the thoughts that guided his friends. After hearing this from Dokoyan, Yuan said that by that logic, she could also be called stupid. Dokoyan didn't quite understand his words. After all, she had told him her most intimate experiences, and in response, she received this. Yuan continued that he considered S-Light and Rushel talented, and no matter how incredible the artifact, if they didn't possess talent, they wouldn't have gotten this far. S-Light certainly has a natural gift to be able to wield such a sword. The only problem is that due to his habit of relying too much on the sword, he cannot react to the situation in a timely manner. But he needs a lot of time to figure himself out. It's the same with Rushel. Her incredible physical abilities and potential are only held back by her own internal contradictions. It won't be easy, but if they can overcome their own problems, their talent will surpass anything Dokoyan and Yuan can imagine. Yuan said this with his eyes shining, believing that one day S-Light and Rushel would be equal in strength to Dokoyan. Dokoyan changed her mind about the boys and said that she would trust Yuan. If they practiced, the results would speak for themselves sooner or later. Yuan asked if that meant she was willing to help. Dokoyan agreed. And if, as he said, the two of them overcome their difficulties and grow, she would admit that Yuan was right. However, if she is not satisfied with the result, the responsibility will fall on him. Yuan was surprised and didn't quite understand what she was getting at. Dokuyan said it was because he made her put her own judgments aside and spend time on S-Light and Rushel. So if he hasn't changed his mind, let him come to training tomorrow and take them with him. Yuan didn't quite understand why tomorrow morning, since they had only just returned from the tower today. But one way or another, the next morning they were already at training. Yuan and Rushel watched in surprise as Dokgoyon beat up S-Light. It seemed like she was just taking out all her anger on him. It seemed that there was no living place left on S-Light. S-Light asked Yuan why this happened. After all, he promised to teach him something new, but in the end, he only got it. Dokgoyon didn't give S-Light even a minute's rest and told him to get up to continue training. She said they were currently training their bodies, and that's exactly how they do it. After all, S-Light isn't the type to change just by seeing something once, like Yuan. S-Light asked to return his sword to him, but Dokgoyon was categorically against it, until he learned to fight without it. He countered that he was a swordsman, so what was the point of taking a sword from a swordsman? Dokgoyon replied that in that case, if he lost the sword, he would simply die. Training with Dokgoyon was truly unbearably hellish for S-Light. Yuan told him it was necessary for him to become stronger. He'd agreed on this with Dokgoyon beforehand, but he didn't expect it to turn out exactly like this. So I asked him to trust them at least once and try to train without a sword. S-Light of course didn't want this, but he still agreed because he trusted Yuan. And if he had a plan, then it really meant something. So he trusted him and tried to fight without his sword. Yuan's words motivated S-Light, but it didn't last long. This was immediately followed by an unexpected blow from Dokgoyon and words about how he was too open. Dokgoyon continued to strike, and S-Light didn't even try to defend himself. She told him he must rely not only on his eyes to see her attacks, but also feel them with all his senses. S-Light replied that he already understood that. Dokgoyon noted that if he understood, then he should fix it right now, or his fighting instincts were really that dulled without a sword. It was true. Right now, S-Light's stats were being artificially reduced in real time. Normally, he was a monster that would easily have dealt with a recto, but for some reason, when he's without his sword, his abilities seem to leak away. If these changes are indeed due to the sword, then S-Light's condition is worse than one might imagine. Dokgoyon continued to strike and tell S-Light he was worthless and getting weaker, but he continued to deny it. She continued, "If you really think so, then let you prove it by looking into my eyes, and not at the sword that you can't even hold." And suddenly something strange started happening to S-Light. He finally managed to break Dokgoyon's pace and attack her, albeit unsuccessfully. Yuan and Rushel, who were watching their sparring, were also surprised by S-Light's changes. His appearance changed to that of a woman. Could this really have been hiding inside him all this time? A moment after that, something strange happened to his body again. It was as if everything inside him was burning, and he looked like a time bomb. Yuan ran to his aid, worried about his comrade. But Dokgoyon stopped him, saying that S-Light was fine, answering that what happened to him was not so easy to solve. Dokgoyon wanted to make sure S-Light knew what the problem really was. He replied that it was. He and Yuan were right. He can't do this anymore either, so he's ready to spar again. Before that, Dokgoyon wanted to apologize to him for being wrong about him. S-Light replied that it was not necessary, but Dokgoyon continued. "I thought you were an ignorant fool, but if you think about it, you are a fool who carries a bomb on himself." S-Light already thought that she would praise him, but everything turned out the opposite. At this point, Rushel suggested that Yuan have a sparring match to keep up with them, but Yuan was lost in his thoughts at that moment and didn't notice Rushel. With his eyes, he saw something strange. S-Light possessed both holy and demonic spirits. How could such contradictory concepts exist in the same body? That seemed to be the reason for the outburst, but did S-Light understand it? He wanted to talk to him about it later in the dorm. Yuan apologized to Rushel for ignoring her. He'd simply been lost in his thoughts. She replied that everything was fine and suggested they spar. He asked if everything would be okay, to which Rushel replied that she didn't know, but he had a way to stop her. But even if that was the case, Yuan was still afraid of it. Rushel noted that she also wants to learn to control her power and wants to be useful. Yuan finally agreed, but noticed that Rushel seemed oddly motivated today. Had yesterday really shocked her so much? Still, sparring is sparring, and they will fight with wooden swords. Yuan said that it was to set their own pace, and there was no need to be as noisy as S-Light and Dokgoyon, so they will increase the intensity gradually. You can start. What suddenly Yuan wondered, was this the life he dreamed of at university? The period of his youth that he imagined was not a chaotic brawl, full of aimless blows and gnashing of teeth. On the contrary, he thought that the young man and woman would encourage each other, honing their skills together. Yuan thought he'd hit the jackpot. Could it be that, thanks to Rushel, his dreams would come true? While he was lost in his thoughts, Rushel thought that he was already ready for her to start attacking. And 5 minutes later, Rushel was already bound by Eva's magical chains. It looks like she still has a long way to go before she learns to control her power. Rushel asked if everything was okay, and how many times she'd lost her temper. Yuan replied that he'd lost count after 10 times, but everything was fine. She apologized for it because now Yuan looks beaten up solely because of her. But he replied that everything was fine because he himself promised that he would help. So he was prepared for it, so there's no need to be too upset about it. But their sweet conversation was interrupted by Dokgoyeon, who didn't quite understand why they were flirting instead of training. Yuan denied it, saying he almost died. But in Dokgoyeon's eyes, it looked different. She thought that perhaps Rushel had some ulterior motives. Dokgoyeon told Rushel that practicing while daydreaming was rude to her opponent. Therefore, such thoughts should be left aside during sparring. Yuan noticed that Rushel, who had been so motivated, was becoming embarrassed again. Dokgoyeon was being too strict with her. But no, given what happened, isn't it amazing that Rushel even had any motivation? If it had been Yuan, he would have been so upset, and the day would have been a complete waste. Yuan didn't think Rushel had time to improve her mental state, but she's trying her best. Therefore, he did not continue to argue with Dokgoyeon to try to prove anything to her. Yuan said he recently asked the professor if he could take someone with him when leaving the campus. She said yes. Dokgoyeon was sure that Yuan would take her with him, but Yuan had a different opinion and decided that from now on, he would take Rushel outside the academy, if she was okay with it. The other boys were extremely surprised by this, but the surprising decisions didn't end there. Yuan asked Rushel to go on a date with him. Yuan and Rushel went into town just to walk around a bit, and the first place they went to was a clothing store. Dokgoyeon and S-Light still continued to think that Yuan was up to something strange, but he said that it wasn't so. Meanwhile, Rushel had already chosen an outfit and went out to show it to Yuan. The outfit was truly stunning, vibrant, and in Rushel's style. Yuan also appreciated it and noted that she looked very beautiful, but Dokgoyeon and S-Light continued to be indignant. It was Rushel's first time outside the academy, so everything was new to her. Yuan suggested taking a walk. There was a department store and shopping area nearby. But Rushel was so carried away by the beauty of the big city that she lost sight of it for a bit. Because of the crowd, it was difficult for her to reach Yuan, and because of the noise, he couldn't hear her. However, Yuan noticed in time that he had lost sight of Rushel. He apologized, saying he forgot that it was her first time in such a place. But Rushel replied that everything was fine. To avoid getting lost in the crowd, they decided to hold hands, although it was a little embarrassing. Together, they continued to walk around the city and went into one of the food stalls to have a snack. Then they went to a toy store where Rushel chose a menacing penguin for herself. Such a walk was more appropriate than ever after what happened in the tower. After a vigorous walk, they decided to grab a bite at a local restaurant. It was a restaurant where all the ingredients were made from monster meat. And even though it was monster meat, the taste was amazing. Rushel was amazed and couldn't believe that she was eating Elon meat while in the city, and it was all thanks to Yuan. At this moment, Yuan noticed Rushel's strange behavior. Suddenly, she started to worry, and Yuan asked what happened, if everything was okay. Rushel replied that she felt too excited. For the first time in a long time, she visited the city, and Yuan gave her some beautiful clothes and treated her to delicious food. But she was worried because she couldn't do anything in return. Rushel wondered if it was okay to enjoy life, since her stay here was unlikely to help her better control her abilities. Yuan asked her to look at him for a second, or more specifically, at his palm, since Rushel couldn't grasp the concept. He explained that the emotions she was experiencing were being formed above his hand. Until recently, his abilities had only detected anger from her. But now, everything was different. In the short time they spent together, he was able to read even such short emotions. If they get closer and understand each other better, Yuan is confident that they can find a solution to her power control problems. Can her abilities see these problems? Yes, but now she can't. Yuan destroyed the concept of the emotion of excitement as an example of how Rushel's problems would disappear. He promised to make sure her problems were resolved and hoped that today she would enjoy the moment without thinking about anything else. Rushel was grateful to Yuan. To her, everything he said seemed like magic that became true. Yuan thought that perhaps it was a burden for Rushel that they were going out so suddenly, but she replied that it was fine. Rushel also said that she would rather talk about how to get closer to her, but Yuan didn't immediately understand what she meant. Rushel added that she had talked about Dokgoyeon and wanted to be friends with her. Yuan denied this, saying there was nothing friendly about her. The girl replied that compared to others, Dokgoyan might be scary to her and others, but it seems that Yuan really likes Dokgoyan. But the young man denied this, believing that she rather simply wanted to wield them, like a weapon or a blade. Yuan's analogy was quite strange, so Rochelle laughed at it. Nevertheless, the girl felt much better after hearing this. She thought that Yuan was an all-knowing wizard or something, but it seems that's not the case. This made her feel like she could try harder, but Yuan didn't quite understand what she was talking about. Still, since Yuan had bought her a lot of clothes and gifts, it was now her turn to choose clothes for him. Yuan simply couldn't refuse Rochelle, so he accepted her offer. He also told her not to think about the price, but rather to simply enjoy it. Rochelle replied that dating such a capable man was a luxury, but Yuan didn't quite understand what she meant. Meanwhile, the professor's meeting was not very cheerful. The professor was carrying an artifact chamber. He tried to convince her that everything was fine and that she just needed to wait a little while. At this time, in the teacher's office, they were watching the video recorded by Yuan from their trip to the tower. They were outraged that such a video had been posted on the internet, thereby thoughtlessly spreading information about the tower. And no matter how Professor Yumina views it, Yuan's independence has gone too far, and this is a clear attack on the Academy's authority. So one of the professors, Alex Canton, asked if Yumina was going to take responsibility for allowing the boy to do whatever he wanted. Yumina didn't expect things to turn out like this and was a little depressed. When she first saw the video, she thought Yuan had gone too far by filming inside the tower. When he said he was going to climb the tower and film it, she didn't pay any attention because she thought it wouldn't work anyway. It was clear that artifacts or external devices could not function inside the tower, as magic would destroy them. That much was obvious. However, he destroyed this obviousness and demonstrated the result. Perhaps Yuan didn't even know about it. It wasn't that he'd brought back a recording from the tower, but that he'd created a device capable of operating within it. And that was astonishing. But the laughs didn't stop there, as Yuan said he plans to post the video on his and his friend's channel. Yuan thought it was a great way to get attention, since the uprising group was a way to gain the favor of other students. Yumina then asked him again if he was confident in his actions, since the information about the tower, which he had obtained with such difficulty, would be disseminated carelessly, and whether he thought he would regret it in the future. But Yuan replied that other students were also suffering. Moreover, besides this artifact, there was no other way to make a recording, and it was as if it monopolized the information. Some points, such as those about constellations, should be edited before publication. The more information they share, the better it will be for everyone. At the time, she thought it was amazing because Yumina had already talked about the unfairness of reality at the Academy, but she never thought that Yuan would resolve it this way. So she just asked him to be careful and remember that there could be consequences. To this, Yuan replied that, as she had already said, it was unclear what changes, big or small, this would bring. So they need to quickly strengthen their position. Because wouldn't the professors be calmer knowing that they are okay? Yumina couldn't imagine that one of Yuan's intentions would be so unusual and wonderful. The professor also told him that if he wanted to be safe, he should avoid accidents. And it seems that what he created will lead to the emergence of something grandiose, capable of bridging the gap between dimensions. Perhaps this is why the professor feels he wants to trust and help the young man. When another professor asked Yumina if she was ready to take on responsibility, she answered confidently. Filming and publishing a video from the tower is his personal business. She understands what the problem is and who, in the teacher's opinion, is to blame. Therefore, Professor Canton's question remains unclear to Yumina. He responded to her words that even her lies were beautiful. And was it really only him who thought that Yuan was being treated specially? But another professor, named Talia Liliana Campanella, intervened in the conversation. She was a professor in the artifact creation department and asked Yumina not to frame her, but to simply answer honestly who Yuan really was. Yumina replied that he was just a student, but was interrupted by the combat aura professor, Ryu Chulmyung. He pointed out that since he was just a student, this was unacceptable, and there was a limit to everything. Yumina knew that the information about the tower was the most important. He added that such behavior was a violation of Academy rules, but Yumina responded that he was saying strange things. After all, the reason no one had filmed in the tower until now was because no one had the ability to do so. So it was better to think about how they could use the student. Professor Canton asked her what this ability was, and what the principle of its operation was, and whether she could explain it so that everyone present would understand. Professor Talia also spoke up, noting that she had been working at the Academy for 200 years. Artifacts created outside the tower do not work inside, especially the high-precision equipment needed for filming. No circuit could resist the waves of mana emitted by the tower. The more she studied it, the more convinced she became that such a thing was impossible. Therefore, according to the professor, this is an inevitable law that cannot be denied. But despite this, Yumina says that Yuan managed to do it somehow. Talia says that's exactly what she's asking about, isn't it? A boy from the underworld, without mana. How can that be explained? And it's as if there is only one way to find out the truth. To do this, Professor Talia required the artifact that filmed the video. Talia was determined to disassemble it and find out what technology Yuan was using. But Yumina replied that she had to refuse Talia, as she had asked permission to take the artifact with her, but it was an achievement created by a student. Therefore, she couldn't allow anyone to do anything with it. Other professors began to see this as a rebellion against them and a refusal to cooperate. And then another professor, known for his bad temper, intervened in the conversation. It was Professor Zeno Union, head of the Constellation Department at Babylon and vice-rector of the Academy. He asked his colleagues to calm down and refrain from making any comments. He thanked Professor Talia for her research and the efforts she has put in over 200 years. Thalia's confidence and volume instantly vanished when the Academy's vice principal spoke. Zeno also asked whether even a professor with such incredible authority in the field considered Yuan's artifact special. Talia replied that it did and didn't know why. The professor replied that this fact must be too difficult for the other professors to accept. His colleagues didn't immediately understand what the vice-rector was talking about. Zenon said that in short, Yuan is the only one in the world who has been recognized as a tower. The professors reacted strongly to Zeno's remarks, calling them frivolous. After all, Yuan had only just entered the tower the day before yesterday, so he could be recognized by it. Many considered his statement reckless, despite the fact that he is the vice-rector. Zeno replied that they had the right to decide whether to believe him or not. But there was another reason to consider him special. He asked Yumina if he could convince the professors if they shared facts that weren't in the video. Without waiting for her answer, Zeno declared in front of the professors that Yuan and his classmates were the only ones among those conquering the tower who had been chosen by the constellations. This caused an even more violent reaction. How could a guy who had just entered the tower for the first time yesterday be chosen as a constellation? Yumina asked Zeno to be careful in his statements, since contact with the constellation is a student's personal achievement. Zenon replied that in that case, he should answer honestly. He was asking as the vice principal whether Yuan and his classmates had signed a contract with the constellation. Yumina didn't understand why the vice-rector was going so far and replied that no one had signed a contract with the constellation. As Zenon suspected, they were not quite ordinary since they refused the contract. He added that it must have been difficult for them to show their intentions due to the pressure of the constellation's presence. In this case, the vice principal will invite Yuan and all 11th grade students to attend his lecture. The professors again reacted violently to his statement, because he himself heard that none of the students signed a contract with the constellation. So why were they receiving assistance in the form of attending lectures at a higher level? Zeno replied that it didn't matter whether they had made a contract with the constellation or not, but that they had been chosen by it. He added that being chosen by a co-star already proves their exceptionalism. From the moment they decline the contract, other co-stars will clearly show interest in them. So Zenon asks his colleagues, aren't these the students who should be receiving help in his lectures? He's the professor who teaches the students chosen by the constellation. And if Yuan was chosen, he's also his student. Now it's time to move on to the agenda, which concerns the recent revelations about interior filming in the tower. For their part, they can't force anything on Yuan. And as far as his abilities are concerned, personal requests and questions will be allowed. But if during the process it turns out that someone is putting pressure on the student or causing him inconvenience, anyone who participates in this, whether a professor or a student, will be expelled from the academy. Yumina realized that this meeting was not about how to bully Yuan, but on the contrary, the vice principal's words expressed the rector's intentions. This was the rector's warning to the faculty. Do not touch Yuan. Now knowing this, Zeno asked the professors to keep this in mind. At this point, the meeting concluded, and he hoped everyone had a good rest of the week. Yumina never thought that Yuan would be able to win the principal's favor so strongly. Meanwhile, Professor Canton suggested that Yumina go to the bar and have a couple of cocktails, if she didn't mind, of course. He also added that he wanted to raise a toast to Yuan's success, but Professor Yumina's gaze said it all. She wasn't interested, so Yumina simply ignored him. Professor Canaton was upset that Yumina ignored him, but his other colleagues invited him to go out for a drink with them. The next day, the entire academy already knew the name Ban Yu-won. Many students began to notice him and wouldn't let him pass by. Some wanted to get to know him, some invited him to the student council, and some wanted to know where he was from. But Yu-won didn't quite understand why there was so much interest in him. Dokgoyeon was also surprised to see this and asked the boys what happened. S-Light responded that the thing was that after they posted the video of the tower climb on their channel crossed the 2 million subscriber mark, and the video itself received over 5 million views. So now it's quite difficult to find someone who doesn't know about their channel. Dokgoyeon didn't think that, compared to his other abilities, filming would be so impressive. Yu-won's ideas and abilities are truly outstanding, and watching people's reactions was even more interesting. This also interested Rushel in its own way. Friends were happy for Yu-won. It must be great to feel like a celebrity. It's much better than getting into arguments with everyone. Besides, they have a ton of fans now, and if anyone talks to them, they have to be kind, especially to Dokgoyeon. Meanwhile, behind their backs, they were already being discussed in a bad light. It was the same trio that had been bothering Rushel, and now they were discussing how the video was actually a montage. After all, they went through 4 rooms so quickly in such a short time, and the size of the spider, in their opinion, is clearly a montage. They also continued to say that their blatant lies would be exposed tomorrow. The thing is that tomorrow is the sparring match between Yu-won and Erecto. Yu-won was sure that those who doubted the video or still disliked it were looking forward to tomorrow when Erecto would destroy it. But his friends believed in him and said that he could win. Dokgoyeon noted that in this case, Yu-won will simply be able to meet and support these expectations as best she can. The day of the sparring session arrived. Yu-won, though a little nervous, was more or less confident of victory thanks to his friend's support. The duel will be broadcast live on the official school channel, and the teacher asked if the students were okay with this. Without a doubt, yes. The professor added that if they agreed, they simply needed to sign the document. Yu-won wasn't entirely clear on the need for such precautions. The document stated that if one of the participants was unable to continue or surrendered, the duel would be considered over. Hitting vital points is forbidden, but injuries are inflicted at one's own risk, as if they are telling them to hit until they become crippled. Erecto called him a negotiator and asked if he was afraid of him. Yu-won was surprised when he called him that. Was he really subscribed to their channel? Erecto continued to say that if he was afraid, he could just give up, but only if he crawls between his legs and barks like a dog. Only then will he accept his defeat. Yu-won was shocked by this statement, and it seemed that Erecto was extremely serious about the fight. Although Yu-won became popular thanks to his videos on the channel, many still hated him for being a creature from the underworld. Meanwhile, Dokgoyeon, S-Light, and Rushel checked to make sure everything was alright with the YouTube broadcast. They were also interested in reading what other viewers were writing about Yu-won. The stream had over 10,000 viewers, but most of the comments were insulting. Dokgoyeon noted that this was to be expected, since the number of people who liked them from their best videos could be counted on the fingers of one hand. So now that so many people are watching them, there is no other option but to prove your competence. And whether Yu-won is talented enough to reach the top or not, he must show his best side today. Meanwhile, Yu-won was pondering Erecto's words. He never would have thought he'd hear something that sounded more like cheap rants from a third-rate novel. But he didn't want to look third-rate in comparison, so he responded to Erecto's offer in a rather rude manner. This made Erecto even more angry, and he asked Yu-won how long he could pretend to be so calm. But Yu-won replied that whether he was pretending or not, Erecto could check for himself. These words angered Erecto even more, and he was already impatiently waiting for the moment when the professor would announce the beginning of the duel. With both participants ready, it was time for the sparring match to begin between Erecto from Class 1 and Yu-won from Class 11. As soon as the professor said this, Erecto immediately rushed into attack. Yu-won didn't expect such a quick attack from him, but thanks to the training and experience gained in the tower, he dodged his blow without much difficulty, and then he counterattacked cleverly. No matter how you look at it, Erecto's dimensions were off the charts, and this greatly affected his speed. Yu-won was able to punch Erecto right in the face when he didn't expect it. The blow was so powerful that he fell to the ground. For Yu-won, the most effective way to fight face-to-face with such a boulder was with the method he had recently learned. Just the day before the sparring, after a date with Rochelle, the whole group went to training. Dokgoyeon wanted to teach him a new technique, but before she began, she noted that the technique allowed for quite a bit of trial and error. The point is, it's good for an inexperienced user, because when facing a new opponent, you need to be able to use their own attacks against them. Only then can you say you've mastered the theory. Therefore, Yuan needed constant training to apply this method in any situation. Goyon planned to attack him with a baton, constantly varying the speed and force of her blows. If he could even just once withstand such an onslaught, that would already be a good result. Although Yuan himself didn't share her opinion at the time. Either way, the technique really did work. If he did it right, Erecto wouldn't even be able to reach him. Erecto didn't even understand what happened and how Yuan managed to attack him. But it wasn't just a punch to the face. There was something special about it. Before striking, Yuan imbued the sword with wave energy, and it seems that Erecto's stone body was excellent at conducting such energy. Erecto was amazed at how strong Yuan actually was, but he didn't want to admit it and continued to babble on about how this young man dared to damage his body. To this, Yuan simply replied that he'd better stop chatting and start fighting. And if he'd already had enough of one blow, he might as well finish it. These words made Erecto lose his temper, and in anger, he tried to hit Yuan, but he dodged again. Erecto's emotions got the better of him. He was no longer able to control himself with anger, and he hated the look he imagined from some underworld upstart looking down on him. Then he used his technique, which greatly increased the force of his hand strike. He hit the ground with all his might, trying to hit the young man. Yuan couldn't understand why Erecto was acting so stupidly. He'd already pulled off a similar attack. Wasn't he willing to try something different? But Erecto was so angry that he didn't care. He just wanted to kill the boy. Erecto continued to chase him around the arena, trying to land at least one blow. However, Yuan's speed was a level higher, and yet, if he continued to attack the same way without taking any countermeasures, all Yuan could do was counterattack. In other words, he had no choice but to counter Erecto in the same manner. His blow was much more powerful and painful than the previous one. It seemed that he injured his opponent's arm. Zeno also watched this fight, but the match seemed pointless to him. Meanwhile, the commentators' opinions changed dramatically. No one could believe that Erecto was so easily inferior in strength to Yuan. Compared to how Yuan was when he first entered, he has become much stronger now. The ardent haters couldn't believe their eyes. Was Erecto really that weak? They even began to think that the video on the Vostanya channel was actually real and not just a good edit. The professor was also perplexed. Just a week ago, the boy was no match for him, and now he looked like a real warrior. How did the young man manage to achieve this in just a few days? At that moment, he received an urgent message directly from the professor's meeting. Yuan didn't know what to do. Attacking someone who couldn't even move due to injuries would look pathetic. If Erecto wants to continue the fight, he needs to get up or he will lose. But the professor declared the sparring over by the observer's decision, without a winner, as Erecto was deemed unfit to continue the fight. This provoked a strong reaction from everyone. The professor added that for the protection of both participants, the sparring was being terminated. Yuan didn't want to accept this outcome. He was certain that if he had been beaten, the professor would have continued the fight until he died. So the young man wanted to clarify something, but the professor simply replied that objections were not allowed. He also demanded that Yuan leave the circle, which he did not agree with. However, the young man still retreated, but it seemed strange to him that the fight ended in such a way, without allowing the winner to be determined. Even though the situation was unpleasant, Yuan didn't look like a loser, which means we can assume that the victory was his. But suddenly, Yuan heard the professor's screams as he tried to stop Erecto. Despite the fight being over and being declared unable to continue, Erecto still rose to continue the fight. He felt it was unacceptable to kneel before someone like Yuan and didn't want to end up with his own shame. A huge boulder rushed towards Yuan, completely ignoring the professor's words. He realized that it would be impossible to stop Erecto and asked Yuan to dodge. But Yuan had a different opinion. Why dodge if you can give a worthy rebuff? Moreover, Erecto seriously intends to kill him, so why can't he respond in kind? He heard the professor's order to stop, but he probably thought that since Yuan was from the lower dimension, he could be ignored. And the teachers who themselves encouraged the fight and then stopped it on a whim, Yuan wanted to answer everyone at once. The Academy's methods were beginning to seriously irritate him. With a powerful blow, Yuan cut off Erecto's right arm. The pain was so intense that it seemed that Erecto's scream could be heard beyond the Academy's dimension. The spectators were shocked by what they saw. This usually doesn't happen in sparring. The professor pleaded with Erecto to calm down, saying that his arm could be restored, while a message window appeared on Yuan's screen. He was faced with a choice: take the concepts from the severed hand or stop. Yu-won hadn't expected such a thing to be possible. Meanwhile, the professor was hastily trying to send Erecto to the medical center and ordered him not to move. After that, he began to scold Yu-won for not dodging, even though he was clearly told to. Yu-won apologized, explaining that everything happened too suddenly and he couldn't react differently. The professor flew into a rage, not considering such words remorseful. At that moment, the Academy's vice-rector intervened. Zeno asked Professor Farrell to calm down and let him sort out the situation himself. He introduced himself to Yu-won as the vice principal of the Academy and said that they had seen everything. From now on, he would start asking questions, so Yu-won had to answer honestly. He couldn't refuse. Zeno asked about Erecto's reckless attack. After all, the young man would not claim that he could not dodge. With his abilities, he could easily have avoided the blow. The vice-rector added that due to the disparity in their strength, he and the professors decided to end the fight. Now they wanted to hear from Yu-won an explanation for what he had done. The professor wondered why he didn't dodge the attack. Yu-won remembered that he had recently gained the ability to use the power of words, but he had never really thought about what it meant. But despite this, the question coming from the screen made him feel uneasy. Even from here, Yu-won felt a tremendous pressure and couldn't imagine who the vice principal really was. Yet he dared to reply that he had not dodged Erecto's attack and had instead counterattacked on a whim. He simply believed that a student who disregarded a professor's authority and acted as he pleased should suffer the consequences. The vice-rector asked again whether he had misheard what Yu-won had said about the authority of professors. The young man added that in addition, in an official sparring match, where the rules must be strictly observed, he wanted to make sure that no one else would break them. Zeno asked why he thought so. Yu-won replied that many students and spectators from other dimensions were watching the sparring. Despite this, Erecto ignored the announcement of the end of the fight and attempted to kill him. He noted that if he had reacted passively, it might have shown that rules could be relaxed when dealing with a student from the underworld. Since there was little time to think, he considers his actions justified, and he acted exclusively in accordance with the principles of the Academy. Zenon noted how resourceful Yu-won was responding, fully aware that many people were currently watching their conversation. He had transferred the problem between the two people to the entire Academy, and the situation could no longer be ignored. However, there was one more thing. Zenon admitted that Yu-won's words were true. Students who disregard the rules of sparring deserve appropriate punishment. But still, punishing students for their misdeeds is the job of the Academy and the teachers, and not the job of people like him. It turns out that Yu-won lost this verbal battle, but he was not going to back down. Professor Farrell believed that it didn't matter what nonsense Yu-won talked, because his opponent was the vice-rector himself. Yu-won agreed that if his actions had undermined the professor's authority, he offered his deepest apologies. The young man added that in any case, he was ready to be punished for what he had done. But the vice-rector simply replied that everything was fine and that he was not going to discuss the punishment. This surprised both Yu-won and Professor Farrell. Zenon added that he was simply curious about what the young man was thinking when he acted like that. And with this, he demonstrated that Yu-won had the determination and eloquence to win the constellation's favor. Ultimately, he declared that the blame lay with Erecto, who ignored the end of the match and attacked. Therefore, Zeno and other professors consider the student's self-defense to be justified. Professor Farrell tried to object to the vice-chancellor, but he ordered him to stop his disgraceful behavior. After all, if he had stopped the enraged Erecto in time, nothing would have happened. Therefore, he too will bear responsibility. Finally, the vice-rector added that reattaching Erecto's arm wasn't such a difficult task, so the sparring could end there. Among the students, of course, there were those who did not want to accept such an outcome. Yu-won's friends, on the contrary, were glad that everything ended peacefully. The vice-rector asked the students to return to their seats and focus on their studies. He also noted that Yu-won had done well and could also leave. At the end, Zenon said they would meet again. This alarmed Yu-won, as he didn't understand what he meant. Returning to his friends, he thanked them for their support. They discussed sparring together. S-Light remarked that the boss fights in the tower had clearly benefited Yu-won. Dokgoyeon also admitted that she enjoyed watching the duel. Yu-won became stronger. She was interested in how his new power felt and how useful it was. Yu-won joked that it was all thanks to his secret training with her, but Dokgoyeon meant something else. The girl spoke of Erecto's hand, which he cut off and absorbed. Yu-won tensed up a little when she brought it up, but he honestly admitted that yes, at the moment when he cut off his hand, he did not think about the consequences. And I didn't even imagine that I could get new concepts in this way. Just in case, he took a little bit and opened two concepts, Giant and Vulcan, which people cannot possess. And it really worked because before he couldn't control the concepts of living beings at will, and now it looks like it will be able to absorb specific parts, cutting them off. In this way, he managed to absorb Erecto's right arm. Dokgoyan didn't understand why Yuan was talking about it with a gloomy expression, even though everything turned out well. He explained that at first he was delighted with his new power, but when he came to his senses, he realized that he had cut off the hand of a man, not a monster. And, remembering the joy of the acquired power, he felt strange and uncomfortable. Dokgoyan simply waved her hand, saying that he was talking nonsense and advised him to keep his head up. After all, Erecto tried to kill him, so the retribution of losing his arm is more than fair. He won, Erecto lost, and that was it. Her words pleasantly surprised Yuan. Dokgoyan added that it doesn't matter who his opponents are. If someone attempts on your life, their fate is already sealed. Her words brought Yuan back to reality, and he apologized to his friends for his dark thoughts. Worrying about such things was truly foolish. Dokgoyan smiled and remarked what would happen if she went through the special classroom and cut off their hands. These words immediately frightened Yuan. S-Light hastened to reassure his friend, saying that, unlike Dokgoyan, he was still human. Dokgoyan didn't appreciate the joke, and it seemed a new quarrel was brewing between her and S-Light. At that moment, Yuan received a strange letter. His reaction was so violent that his friends began to worry about him. It turned out to be Zeno's obligatory lecture with no right to refuse. Professor Zenon's supplementary course, Constellations of Babylon, is only for seniors, fourth-year students and above. In it, he explains how to properly attract the support of the constellations and conduct negotiations. He also shares other useful knowledge and explains how to avoid the wrath of the constellations and make a smooth transition from one to another. On the way to the classroom, they heard other students whispering behind their backs. Yuan was called a salesman who talked a lot and had an air of superiority. The older students were surprised at what 11th grade students were doing here. After all, this place is only for seniors. As they walked towards the auditorium, Yuan wanted to say something. He noted that there was a rumor in their world. The more often you were cursed, the longer you lived. Dokgoyan joked that, in that case, Yuan was destined for immortality. Rochelle was worried about him after yesterday, fearing that now even more people would hate him. After all, everyone judges by rumors, without even knowing who he really is. But Yuan assured her that everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. He thanked her for her concern, but added that she shouldn't worry about it. Dokgoyan suspected something was wrong. After their weekend outing, Rochelle and Yuan seemed to be on the same wavelength. She suggested that perhaps it had something to do with the gifts he'd given her, and if she was going to court him, she should do it elsewhere. Rochelle answered without hesitation that perhaps it was just jealousy. These words touched Dokgoyan, and she was about to use force. But now was no time for quarrels. They had approached the audience, and it was time to go in. S-Light warned Yuan that there had already been a similar lecture last week, and it was unknown how the seniors would react if newcomers from the lower dimensions suddenly appeared. Yuan was also a little worried, but tried to remain optimistic. He hoped the older students would think that promising younger students had joined them, but his hopes were not fulfilled. Few of the elders were happy about their appearance. These seniors were so different from the other students that even Dokgoyan couldn't ignore their strength. Just one look from them put a lot of pressure on them. Even Yuan couldn't help but activate his eyes to find out more about them. Professor Zeno greeted the junior students and was glad to see them at his lecture. As expected, the lecture hall was a place for gifted students, but not to that extent. Yuan couldn't read a single concept. They were all beyond his understanding. The professor began the lecture and introduced the children to the subject, explaining that the purpose of this lecture was simple: to understand the origin of the tower and the constellations. Since they are joined by younger students today, they will first talk about the tower. At first glance, the tower looks like a huge structure without beginning or end. But in reality, it is indistinguishable from a living organism. As they climb the tower, they overcome challenges and discover hidden treasures and secrets within. It looks like they earn rewards by clearing rooms, but it's not that simple. They don't find the rewards. The tower has prepared them for them to reach, to select the most outstanding conquerors among them. With the finest items, exceptional treasures, and thanks to an incredible miracle, the tower itself seeks out those who seek to know and understand themselves. It is best to reveal secrets to those who are capable of understanding them. This is the basic condition for any intelligent being predisposed to a higher level of thinking. Yuan had already accumulated enough questions in such a short period of time. Zenon's lecture seemed pointless to him, Just one intruder had turned the tower's system upside down. How can she be alive and thinking if she chooses her conquerors herself? This seemed too strange to the young man. However, if you think about it, the moment when the rector's letter was sent out en masse happened shortly after the attacker entered the tower. Therefore, they assumed that the spider swarm phenomenon in the fourth room was caused by an uninvited guest. But if you think about it, something odd was already noticeable from the very first room. The thing that instantly killed Rushel was clearly elite. If the tower only started acting strange after they reached that room, then the difficulty of the first, second, and third remains inexplicable. Yuan couldn't understand what was really going on. The professor said that the tower is actually indistinguishable from a living organism, and this may serve as a wild guess. But what if we change the conditions? It's safe to assume the difficulty hasn't changed because of the intruder. It changed because they began to ascend. The difficulties from the very beginning were caused by the tower's independent thinking, and perhaps that's why it placed them there. Or maybe it was because Yuan, the descendant of the tower's master, had begun his ascent. These thoughts turned everything upside down in Yuan's head. He no longer understood where the truth was and where the lie was. Watching him, Professor Zeno also noticed something strange about the young man. Yuan continued to think, if the tower thinks and chooses climbers as the professor said, then there will never be a better moment. After all, their class faces challenges and situations that are unlike any other. As has been said, high risk comes with high reward. The rewards the tower has in store are destined to be on a whole new level. Yuan was also worried that he still hadn't been able to master the concepts taught in the classroom, and suddenly Zeno asked him if he'd managed to master it, the concept of a barrier around. He noted that some students don't notice it even after years, but discovering this sphere on the very first day was quite remarkable. Zenon praised Yuan for his intuition. Zeno also added that, as expected, as first years, they fully meet the requirements needed to take this lecture. In this regard, the professor had one small question for Yuan. Zeno asked the young man what he saw in this sphere, but Yuan couldn't see anything. Everything seemed unknown and beyond his comprehension, so he honestly answered the professor that he didn't see anything. Zeno asked him to concentrate a little better and try again, but nothing was working. The professor continued to insist that he try to concentrate again. He had to see something in the sphere to unlock its secret, and suddenly, Yuan managed to see something. Something he had already encountered before. Inside the sphere, he saw the concepts of barrier, gap, and protection. But unfortunately, for now, it all looked like he couldn't absorb it. The professor thanked him and told him to stop and rest a little. Zeno was not mistaken. The young man was truly unusual. He had just managed to unlock the 3 main abilities of the sphere. Now it became clear to Zenon why the rector was keeping such an eye on Yuan. The professor asked Yuan if he understood what this sphere was. Yuan answered honestly that he didn't understand anything yet. Zenon acknowledged his honesty, but suggested it would be better if he thought about it a little more. The professor wanted to emphasize to everyone, both in the classroom and in everyday life, the power of thought and the development of imagination are important, because the expansion of thought is directly related to increased strength. Therefore, if students want to use their skills at a more advanced level, they need to develop the power of thought, their driving force. Yuan didn't quite understand what was going on and asked the professor if someone with high cognitive abilities could really control the sphere. Zeno replied that everything was correct. That's why it's so important to develop your thinking. Even if the answer doesn't come right away, you can't stop thinking. Once you understand the structure of all things, analyze them, and learn to think big, this sphere can turn a person into a kind of pseudo-god. But Yuan still didn't fully understand what exactly the professor was talking about. Zenon noted that this may be difficult to understand now, but that understanding will come naturally as the lectures progress. This is the core material of his course, also related to the main lecture, Simulating the War of the Constellations. At this point, today's lecture ended, and as an assignment, the professor asked them to imagine possible uses for the sphere. And yet, Yuan found it difficult to understand all this, despite the professor's explanations. If this is God, then what is a pseudo-god? A being resembling God, or a false god? These thoughts haunted the young man. Eastlight suggested the boys return to the dorm, but Yuan continued to ponder the principle of becoming a god. Perhaps it was difficult to understand because they were freshmen and the lecture was too difficult. On the way back, Yuan asked the boys if anyone could explain the lecture material again. Eastlight was surprised to hear him say so, as he'd expected Yuan to summarize it for the others. Suddenly, they encountered Ortima, the very same rival of Dogoyan. Yuan asked him what he was doing there, but the proud Ortama only wanted to know where Dokgoyan was. The guys didn't quite understand what he was talking about and why he suddenly needed Dokgoyan. She lagged behind them a little on the way and came up a little later, surprised to see that everyone was huddled together. Dokgoyan thought something big had happened, but luckily it was just Ortama. As he himself said, he came to her on special business. Dokgoyan thought that he wanted to have another duel, a so-called rematch. She told him that if that was the case, then if he wanted to die, she would not stop him. However, this was not a desire for a duel. Ortama had completely different intentions. Ortama came here to ask her out on a date. The boys were surprised to see the ruler of the dimension inviting Dokgoyan for a walk. Yuan didn't understand what kind of person you had to be to fall in love with a woman who beat you half to death. S-Light noticed that Yuan had answered his own question, hinting at it. But Dokgoyan believed that Ortama was simply plotting some kind of plan against her. The boys were surprised to hear this because it didn't sound like a sinister plan at all. Dokgoyan was sure he had an ulterior motive. There was no trace of affection in his gaze. Yuan countered that that wasn't the case at all. Maybe it was because she was beautiful. Dokgoyan didn't understand how Yuan could say such embarrassing things so casually. At this point, Rushel began to think, what if there really wasn't any catch there? After all, at that moment, Ortama didn't look like he was planning anything bad. He seemed sincere at the time, but Dokgoyan thought he was up to something and replied that she wasn't interested in him. At that moment, Ortama really looked depressed. It seems that this was not the answer he expected to hear from her. Meanwhile, the guys continued training. Yuan discovered new concepts, charm, and honor after uploading them to his channel. His charm allowed him to enchant and influence others. However, he still didn't understand how this would help him advance through the tower. Yuan asks Rushel if his face had changed recently. She didn't quite understand what he meant and said she thought he looked very attractive. But that wasn't quite what he wanted to clarify. Hearing their conversation, Dokgoyan became furious again. She reminded them that during training they should concentrate, and during rest periods they should rest, not fool around. Yuan asked Dokgoyan if his face was okay, but she told him to focus on training and not do stupid things. Yuan continued to train with Rushel, helping her control her power. With such training, he wanted to establish her control over the animal part. S-Light noted that Yuan had indeed gotten stronger and suggested that perhaps they should stop focusing on dungeons and move on. But Dokgoyan replied that although he had become stronger, he was still far behind her and Rushel. Their training together was only successful because each of them acted gently towards the other. In any case, tomorrow they were planning to head out to the tower again. Dokgoyan was interested in whether Yuan had managed to figure out what to do with Rushel, since the pace of the expedition was no different from last week. If they fail to find a solution quickly, they will face the same thing again as last time. Over the past week, while observing Rushel, Yuan noticed several things. Her heart was driving her crazy, and any emotion became fuel for her. Her state changed dramatically depending on what emotion fueled her. If negative emotions served as food, she burned more and more intensely and lost control of herself. And when it was nourished by calm and positive feelings, the riot subsided and the emotions stabilized. In combat, strong emotions inevitably intensify, making a state of rage almost inevitable. But if Yuan can change the fuel to something positive, it might work. And now he needed to test this theory in practice. He finally managed to calm Rushel down, at least for a while, and stop her continuous attacks. All last week, he had not been having fun, but trying to find a way to help her. Spending time with her, he collected her emotions when she was happy, having fun, or feeling calm. These were not artificially created feelings, but copies of her own emotions. Now Yuan intended to use them as fuel for Rushel, hoping that it would help. At least that's what he hoped for and believed it would work. But the theory turned out to be much simpler than the practice, and Yuan failed to make Rushel absorb the positive emotions. On the contrary, she became even more aggressive and counterattacked him. Having knocked him to the ground without much effort, she became more and more furious, like a wild animal. Dokgoyan and S-Light rushed to his aid, and at that moment, Yuan used Eva to grab Rushel with chains. It was a miracle he survived. But who knows what could have happened if he had thought for a second. However, Yuan noticed that Rushel seemed to have returned to normal faster than they could have chained her up. It turns out that there was progress, and that was encouraging, but waiting for it every time was too dangerous. There were definitely changes, but exactly what they were was still unclear. Rushel thanked Yuan, although he wasn't entirely sure why. He replied that it was too early to thank them since they hadn't completely solved the problem. But she said she could now fight with peace of mind. It was a big step for her, and she was glad that Yuan was there. But their conversation was interrupted by Dokgoyan again. Yuan, as always, was tensed when he saw her so close. But everyone was glad that no one was seriously hurt. However, Dokgoyan noticed some strange change in Rochelle. For some reason, she decided to remain silent, only saying that training was over for today. Rochelle was alarmed by the fact that Dokgoyan seemed to want to say something, but changed her mind. The next day, they went to the tower, and S-Light wondered why he couldn't take the sword with him. Dokgoyan explained that they had agreed to build a solid foundation without rushing things. After all, this was only their second study in the first semester, so ES-Light shouldn't worry. But he was still worried, and Yuan noted that the more he used the Holy Sword, the more it depended on him. The concept of a demon combined with a Holy Spirit no longer gave Yuan the confidence that it was truly a holy sword. Therefore, it was better to keep S-Light away if this weapon had a negative effect on him. S-Light said that if he fell through the tower because of this, he wouldn't be blamed. Dokgoyan replied that they wouldn't blame him, they'd just make him suffer even more. Before the trip, Yuan decided to review his characteristics once again. Compared to what he had before, he has now become several times stronger. He also prepared Eva and Taiki, living artifacts that were integral parts of his power. Before the trip, Rushel told Yuan that she would do her best not to lose control and would listen carefully to everything he said. Yuan pointed out that he was indeed strong in a real fight, and Rochelle naturally believed him. Dokgoyan wanted to clarify a few things with him before they left. She reminded him that the first assessment would take place today, and frankly, she was disappointed with Eastlight and Rochelle, unless he had forgotten the promise he made to her. Yuan replied that he remembered, and added that they had both already begun to change, so there was no need to expect immediate results. Everything would be as he said. However, Dokgoyan was worried about Rochelle, especially about what she was going to say yesterday. Rochelle tried to eavesdrop on their conversation discreetly, but Dokgoyan noticed it without any difficulty. She used some technique to muffle Rochelle's hearing. A strange ringing sound began in Rochelle's ears that only she could hear. Dokgoyan asked Yuan if he knew what submissiveness was. He replied that it was being dominated. She countered that this was not entirely true. From the perspective of the one being dominated, it might feel uncomfortable, but some people find stability in strong, firm leadership. In this sense, according to her, Rochelle really likes someone who is able to completely control and subjugate her. Yuan didn't quite understand where Dokgoyan was going with this, so she decided to speak frankly. When the beast becomes uncontrollable, empty talk is useless. But even so, Yuan still didn't understand what she was talking about, and this irritated Dokgoyan quite a bit. She said that if he didn't understand, then at least let him remember her words. The boys had no time to think. Right now, they had to try to conquer the tower again. Yuan called this the second sortie of the special selection freshmen and told everyone to get ready. The new room was very different from the previous ones, not only in appearance, but also in terms of pressure. If before the rooms resembled caves, now everything looked like another planet with a view of space. Dokgoyan was even a little confused, deciding that they would start from the first room. However, this place did not look like a starting area at all. A labyrinth awaited them. Yuan noted that, judging by the pendant, they were currently on the 5th floor. And yet, despite the fact that it was only the 5th floor with a labyrinth, the oddities did not end there. Yuan noticed how Rochelle started to act strangely. She walked to the side, ignoring the others. Rochelle claimed to sense a monster nearby and asked Yuan to catch it. He was surprised that instead of finding a way, she found the monster first. Suddenly, Yuan noticed something too, but it didn't look like a monster. It looked more like a system glitch. Perhaps their last attempt was starting to repeat itself, they thought. S-Light assumed it looked like a secret passage like the one on the 1st floor, but Yuan said it was something else. It sounded like it was about to break, like it was about to crack. And at that moment, Rochelle lunged at what she thought was a monster. Without thinking, she hit it, and the unknown object disappeared. Then a window with a code appeared in front of Yuan, which said that he had opened an unknown glitch that had new concepts of malfunction and inversion. As the young man expected, it was a glitch phenomenon. When the signal is disrupted, both the image and sound are distorted, and inversion adds a suspense effect at the moment the monster appears. Since this type was completely unlike any monster he'd encountered before, completely unfamiliar concepts were at play. Yuan tried to understand how malfunction and inversion interacted with each other, and while he was deep in thought, one of the monsters attacked him. Fortunately, Dokgoyan managed to react in time and destroyed the threat. She reminded us that we need to be more attentive and keep moving. The path is difficult, and we can't stand still. Dokgoyan also added that it was a mental-type monster which usually doesn't appear on the 5th floor, But under these circumstances, nothing surprises her anymore. While they were running, Yuan continued to build up his inversion. Perhaps it would come in handy. Meanwhile, Rushel also continued to fight the monsters. Although she could still control herself, for some reason she couldn't stop. Yuan said that she shouldn't fight alone, otherwise she would risk going berserk. Therefore, he noted that for now, it would be better for her to stay close to him. Tokoyon continued to remind everyone to be alert and not get distracted by conversations. Yuan decided not to try to absorb the concepts emerging from the walls of the labyrinth for now, putting it off until later. Right now, he needed to focus on absorbing concepts from the glitches. Quite a lot of time had passed, but they continued to move along the route, as if in a circle. Dokgoyan noted that it was indeed strange. She remembered every route she had taken, but despite the changed shape of the passages, this place seemed familiar. The thing was that this was not an ordinary labyrinth, but one that changed in real time. Therefore, according to Dokgoyan, the only way is to destroy the labyrinth entirely. Her words gave Yuan an interesting thought. The thing is, he was so caught up in collecting inversion that he missed something important. Just when Dokgoyan was about to destroy the labyrinth, Yuan asked her to wait a bit. He explained that a constantly changing path made no sense, meaning there had to be a hidden exit somewhere, perhaps some kind of camouflage door right in the wall. His guesses turned out to be correct. The young man found a key hidden in the wall. Thanks to this, he absorbed the concept of illusion, which is inaccessible to ordinary people. The other side of the labyrinth opened up before them, another part of the room. The boys were surprised how Yuan had managed to discover this. He admitted that he'd noticed the place a long time ago, but had been too focused on collecting concepts and had ignored the discovery. However, Yuan explained to his friends that he didn't like wasting time either, so after observing what was happening for a couple of hours, he found an area that seemed strange to him. This gave Dokgoyan a thought. Yuan had managed to find a magical vulnerability that even she hadn't noticed. As she suspected, Yuan is more than just a genius. He's far beyond that. Meanwhile, the group continued to move through the labyrinth, destroying magical vulnerabilities. This also paid off for Yuan, as he continued to accumulate more and more valuable concepts. But there was one problem. The young man had hit the ceiling. His magical power had reached 199,999 and was not increasing any further. Even though Yuan had absorbed enough concepts, even more than necessary, his magical power still did not grow, unlike his life or body. Suddenly, Dokgoyan crept up to him unnoticed. The young man was so immersed in his thoughts that he didn't notice her. She asked what was bothering him, and he replied that despite defeating an elite monster, his magic power was not increasing. Hearing this, Dokgoyan laughed slightly, but Yuan didn't share her amusement. She explained that it was all because he had hit a wall. He absorbed energy, as if sucking it out of everything around him, but he continued to water the plant, not giving it time to grow, which is why he quickly reached his limit. So trying to surpass the limit by blindly hunting monsters right now isn't the best option. She noted that there is a more effective and efficient method that can help him. At that moment, she looked at Rushel with suspicion, which scared her a little. Dokgoyan said that instead of hanging around campus on weekends, it was better to breathe fresh air, eat delicious food, and go shopping, hinting that while she and Yuan were having fun, she continued studying. But Yuan asked her to tell him about this method, promising in exchange to consider going out to eat or shopping with her. Dokgoyan agreed, noting that it would take time. The best thing he could do now was learn the basics of the divine manifestation art, Hyun Singon. Despite its grand name, this is just a basic martial art and won't be too difficult. Until now, Yuan had only studied principles from Dokgoyan, but had never directly practiced martial arts. Could this be the beginning of real training? Yuan asked if he shouldn't at least go through a formal apprenticeship ceremony or something. Dokgoyan replied that this was just basic internal training that even children learned, so it was better for them to prepare. She was surprised by Yuan's words. After all, he was a person from another world, but he was talking about a formal apprenticeship ceremony. She pretended that it didn't mean anything, although, in fact, the art of divine manifestation is not a martial art that can be taught simply at will. It's a secret technique, strictly passed down through generations, and if her father knew about it, he would be quite shocked. After all, they met only recently, he is a stranger from another world, and she is already passing on the family technology to him. Yuan was already ready, but he didn't understand why he needed to undress. Dokgoyan herself couldn't imagine that she would one day pass on a secret art, intended only for the descendants of her family, to someone like Yuan. So if she ever told anyone about it, it would only be when he became her husband. But since she'd already agreed, she had to see it through. Tokoyan told Yuan to sit up straight and calm his mind. From the moment they met, she had a strange feeling growing in her, a desire to raise this person with her own hands. Yuan was different from anyone she had met before. His talent in martial arts was undeniable, but his potential was even more impressive. If such a person develops systematically, it will be interesting to see how quickly and far he can advance. These thoughts haunted Dokoyan, and at the same time, she didn't want anyone other than her to influence his potential. She herself did not understand what it was about him that made her experience such feelings. But now was not the time to be distracted by such thoughts. She asked Yuan again if he was ready. Yuan asked if before starting, shouldn't Dokoyan recite a mantra or some kind of introductory speech, explain the technique, its name, essence, and application? This made Dokoyan laugh. She replied that even if he read it, he would hardly understand. It would be easier to implant it into his body right away. But regarding the apprenticeship ceremony, she became curious about where Yuan got such knowledge of martial arts. But Yuan refrained from answering. After all, if he'd said he'd read too many martial arts novels, Dokoyan would have definitely beaten him up. She warned that she was starting the process. Yuan wanted to say something, but it was too late. The divine manifestation technique that Dokoyan was going to teach him would completely change the nature of his chi, mana, and body. The body will constantly absorb magical power, creating pure chi. And since the body and mana are trained simultaneously, their capacity will naturally increase. Roughly speaking, you filter magical power and transform it into pure chi. When Dokoyan touched Yuan, it felt like a fireball had burst into him. It felt like it was madly devouring mana and moving throughout my entire body. It was as if he was paving a path where none had existed before. Yuan began to worry that his body would burn out from all this energy. But Dokoyan told him to calm down, explaining that burning one's way inside the body, constantly moving divine chi, is the basis of divine manifestation. Once he completes his training, the further path will open up to him. Blue flames continuously moved inside Yuan's body. Over time, he began to feel much better and realized that using mana directly was not always the best choice. He also acquired a new martial arts concept, divine manifestation, and reached the 20th level of comprehension. This eliminated some negative concepts in his body, while the excess positive potential accelerated the development of others. As Dokoyan had said, the concepts in his body were gradually replaced by divine chi. The more he trained, the more he felt himself growing. Yuan thanked Dokoyan and asked what gift she wanted in return. She replied with a smile that she was looking forward to it and would definitely think about it. In the meantime, he better wipe off the sweat if he doesn't want to conquer the tower alone. Yuan felt a strange feeling. If he concentrated a little harder, he might be able to sense the circulation of divine chi. The more filtered chi passed through the body, the stronger the body became and the sharper the senses. Yuan never imagined that such an effective martial art would be given to him so easily. S-Light asked if he was going to upload a video of the process, but Yuan replied that of course not. Dokoyan asked why, which made Yuan a little nervous. The guys started joking that such a video would get a ton of views, but Yuan just said that something like that would definitely not happen on their channel. S-Light offered his friends a snack, as they had been wandering around the floor for quite some time. But Dokoyan replied that she was against it. They had already lingered on the 5th floor for too long, so they could forget about food until they got to the 6th. And suddenly they managed to see something that looked like an exit. It was a huge door. Perhaps the entrance to the next room was hidden behind it. S-Light suggested that the road to the 6th level should be behind this door, but Yuan had his doubts. He asked his friends not to rush into a decision and give him a second to think. Yuan felt like something strange was going on, and that there was something wrong with this door. Using his eyes, he noticed the dim traces of another concept. Yuan didn't immediately understand where they were leading, inside the door or outside it. Although the situation was tense, Yuan became curious and stepped forward first. He didn't explain anything to the others, so they decided to follow him. At first glance, there was nothing behind the door. It looked like just a wall. S-Light suggested that perhaps they had gone the wrong way. At first, that was what it seemed like. But if you looked more closely, you could see something. With his eyes, Yuan noticed many concepts on the wall. The wall was densely filled with illusions. Yuan decided to touch the illusions. Perhaps something would happen. And so it happened. He destroyed the concepts of illusion and opened a new passage. The guys were surprised and didn't understand what it was, but it was obvious. This was a new exit. Dokoyan noted that this appears to be a shortcut. Having shattered the wall of illusions, Yuan absorbed 50 concepts. This was incredible, as he had previously only collected 0.1 each. He was glad that he had managed to find such a well-hidden secret path. Yuan asked the others what they would do now that they had found the shortest route. Perhaps the shortcut is actually more dangerous than the usual one. But the boys cast aside their doubts and ran towards the new path at once. Yuan decided to feed 50 illusion concepts to Eva to make her even stronger. The shortest route didn't resemble a normal road. It was a long staircase leading straight up. Yuan suggested that perhaps the room was shifting as they ascended, but there was no distinct shift. Dokgoyeon suggested that perhaps the staircase was the shift. Rochelle noted that Kulam indicated that they were now on the 8th floor. Yuan was surprised that the route was so short. They managed to skip 3 rooms at once. S-Light remembered what the guidebook said about this. A shortcut was a great success, but the more rooms they passed, the more difficult the one they ended up in would be, although the reward for it was higher. However, S-Light still remained worried and asked that next time they avoid shortcuts. Yuan couldn't understand why he was so scared. This hadn't happened last time. Moreover, he seemed less stable, constantly thinking about his sword. Dokgoyeon continued to chide S-Light for relying too much on his sword. Perhaps it would have been better if she had broken it. At that moment, Yuan and Rochelle seemed to have found a way out. At the end of the climb, there was something that looked like a door. Could it be that they had finally reached the exit? Since the pendant showed the 8th level, the 9th should be waiting for them behind this door. Rochelle advised Yuan to be careful after sensing hostility outside the door. It was just like that time when she had the feeling of a monster's presence. Dokgoyeon agreed that caution wouldn't hurt, adding that when they got up, S-Light could draw her sword. S-Light was so happy about this that without a second thought, he rushed to be the first to look at the next floor. This floor was again different from those they had visited. There were no monsters or high ceilings here. S-Light assumed they had entered a recreation area, but Yuan doubted it. There was no mention of a rest area anywhere. Meanwhile, a stranger was hiding behind one of the columns. He suddenly used his power and fired straight at the group. A flying ball, similar to a bullet bomb, headed towards Dokgoyeon. Dokgoyeon was surprised to see this, not immediately understanding what had happened. There was a powerful explosion. The boys were worried if she was okay. Dokgoyeon managed to stop the attack and ask Yuan what it was, as it had been said before that no one but him could use the weapons in the tower. Yuan suggested that the enemy's weapon might be disposable. Using his eyes, he easily found the enemy, who then attacked them from behind. He ordered S-Light to run after the attacker and catch him. The stranger did not immediately understand that he had been identified and how Yuan had found his hiding place. He was certain his stealth skills shouldn't be judged by novices. But at that moment, S-Light pierced him with his sword. It confused him, but he still hoped that the situation was under control. Initially, he wanted to remove S-Light and then destroy the entire group. Yuan asked if Dokgoyeon was okay, noting that if the shot had hit someone else, it could have been dangerous. He also noticed that this was no ordinary projectile. Right now, Dokgoyeon had her foot on a magic bomb, a very powerful one at that. But Yuan managed to defuse it. Meanwhile, the battle between S-Light and the unknown enemy continued. S-Light struck, not giving the enemy a chance to counterattack. While he was off guard, Yuan threw his own bomb at him. When the stranger reached for the detonation button, everything turned against him. He was shocked to see his own bomb right above his head. He expected an explosion, but was very surprised when the bomb did not explode after bouncing off the column. But one way or another, he no longer had time to be surprised. After all, despite this, his main opponent was still S-Light, and for his loss of vigilance, he paid with his life. S-Light asked why he attacked them and how he ended up here. Yuan also approached them and asked if, even after he had identified him, he still hadn't realized that he had bombs in his shells. The enemy relied too much on his skills and ended up getting caught. But the stranger did not answer, but on the contrary, began to ask them who they were. He was also curious about what a strong rookie like Yuan was doing on the lower floors. After his sharp outburst, a magic projectile from Dokgoyeon flew at him. He couldn't even imagine the trouble he was in, thinking that it would be easy to deal with them. Dokgoyeon said that before they could discuss everything peacefully, she would rather break his arms and legs so that he wouldn't do anything stupid. Meanwhile, anger at the stranger also gripped the seemingly calm Rochelle. Succumbing to negative emotions, she began to go into berserker mode and said that if they didn't kill this guy, he would kill them. She lunged at him without warning, but luckily, Yuan managed to stop her with his magic chains. But even so, Rochelle continued to be aggressive and ignore Yuan's words. Suddenly, a strange and frightening voice began to be heard from somewhere. The voice said that one of them had failed their mission, and apparently this voice was addressing the stranger. He continued that, given the situation, it looks like this guy's role had come to an end. He tried to argue that he could still be useful, but at that moment, something strange began to happen to his body. The voice continued to say that by sacrificing himself, he would earn the share of his comrades. It looks like the guy was about to explode, so Yuan ordered everyone to move away. The voice still spoke of sacrifice, despite the stranger's pleas for another chance. And at that moment, his body was compressed so tightly from the inside that it literally exploded, and the blast radius was quite large. The explosion resembled the detonation of a bomb, as if there really was something inside the guy. In the last seconds, Yuan managed to escape the powerful explosion. It even seemed to him that for a moment, he saw a river of dead people, as if he was already there with one foot. If I hadn't had time to react, I would have truly become a part of it. Realizing that he couldn't dodge in time and was caught in the blast radius, Yuan decided to use the concept of a magic bomb. He was able to stop the explosion with another explosion, and if he had been even a second late, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Eastlight was curious about what had happened to the guy. Yuan simply replied that he must be fine, and he returned to the first level of the tower. But suddenly, the same mysterious voice spoke again, declaring that the boy was already dead, as the tower's will had interpreted his actions as a kill in combat. Essentially, it was the same as if they had killed him themselves. Yuan replied that this was nonsense, since it was this voice that pushed him to his death. The voice continued to talk about sacrifice, and how they had lost a valuable comrade without receiving anything in return. And now they should be more careful, for the tower had begun to favor them. Yuan didn't understand what he was talking about, and decided to ask him directly who he was, and also who that guy really was, and why he tried to kill them. An unfamiliar voice replied that they were Exodus, adding that even though they were enemies, they would not mind meeting them again. The boys were surprised by the sudden turn of events in the tower. Rushel noted that, unlike the previous constellation, this one at least gave its name. However, S-Light corrected them, saying it wasn't a name, but the name of an organization. Eastlight added that Exodus is the most notorious pirate group in all dimensions. Most likely, some constellation patronizes them. The boys realized that these were the very pirates Professor Yumina had spoken of, and this worried them. Not only had they been greeted by a constellation, but now pirates were hunting them. Dokoyan noted that they were bound to encounter them anyway, so it was better to continue climbing higher and becoming stronger. But Light asked if they didn't find it strange that the constellation had just mentioned that the tower treated them specially. He noted that the constellation thus confirmed their suspicions about the tower. Surely no one felt strange? At that moment, Eslight, Rushel, and Dokgoyan received a notification. They looked at him strangely, so Yuan asked what was wrong. He was worried that it was another letter from the director, but Dokgoyan replied that it was not quite so. It was a letter about leveling up and the corresponding rewards, and it came to everyone except Yuan. Dokgoyan noted that this was her first level up since joining. Perhaps it happened after they survived the constellation's attack. Eslight was also surprised, but, unlike the joyful Dokgoyan, it made him nervous and, to some extent, irritated. And Rushel was simply happy that her stats had increased. Yuan was amazed because their stats were already off the charts, and now they had risen even higher. He couldn't understand why he was the only one left without a reward. Was it because he didn't have a status window? He refused to believe it because he also wanted to receive his reward. Looking at the site of the explosion, Yuan noticed something strange. Something that resembled a concept. But this concept looked different from those he had seen before. It looked more like a line of text, so Yuan decided he could absorb it. After all, since everyone received their awards, it means he has the right to. Having absorbed the concept, he felt a strange feeling, unlike any he had experienced before. His body began to change and his stats increased noticeably. Along with this, he discovered two new concepts: myriad forms and stigmata. Simply put, the myriad forms is the ultimate concept of transformation, and the stigmata is likely related to the constellations. Since he now had an improved form of transformation, Yuan decided to test it out. He asked Eva if she was okay with the concept, and she of course agreed. Besides, as Yuan noted, there is no point in holding on to concepts that he himself cannot use. However, as soon as Eva absorbed the concept, something strange began to happen to her, which greatly frightened Yuan. The other boys turned around at his cry and asked him what had happened. Turning around, they saw Yuan holding Eva, who had somehow transformed into an egg. She had acquired the form of a subject because she possessed a lower conceptual principle, which led to mutation. Yuan noted that something similar had happened before, but then she hatched immediately after the transformation. This time, no. Dokgoyeon suggested that perhaps she had also leveled up, but Yuan was still worried. But it seems they found an excellent way to calm Rushel down if something happens. S-Light said the next room was the rest room and suggested they head there. Perhaps Eva would wake up by then. The lounge was significantly different from the others. It wasn't just an empty room, but something more, the famous 10th room, which many have only heard about. S-Light reminded that if the tower's conquerors were unlucky, there would be no food or water here, but it seems they were very lucky to stumble upon such a beautiful garden. The room revealed a garden where the trees bore fruits known as fruits of Eden. They relieved fatigue and increased stamina. Plus, they tasted absolutely amazing and incredibly sweet. Yuan remarked that he'd never tasted anything so delicious before. Dokgoyeon agreed, adding that she'd never tasted anything so sweet either, and felt her energy increase slightly. She suggested eating all the fruit before moving on, but Eastlight objected that it was pointless, since the effect only worked from one fruit. Yuan still wanted to find some way to take a couple of fruits with him, but he didn't yet understand how. Suddenly, a code window appeared in front of him, informing him that he had eaten the one and only fruit of Eden, the fruit of evil. And now his eyes were able to discern sins. Yuan didn't quite understand how he managed to get something like that just by eating a fruit that resembled a fig. And yet he became curious about the standards by which sin was defined here. Meanwhile, Rushel called everyone over, asking them to look at the find. She had found something that resembled a chest. Dokgoyeon guessed it was probably a reward for their success. Even though it seemed to be the lowest rank, there had to be something unique inside. Yuan agreed, adding that he felt like they had packed in all the challenges most teams would normally face into just one outing. He also recalled hearing about similar rewards. Each recreation area offers a treasure to mark the progress of the tower's climbers. They received a wooden chest with gold trim. It's likely low grade, but the contents are high quality. Yuan also noted that the treasures are enhanced if the chest is bronze, silver, or gold. S-Light was already eager to open the chest and see what was inside, but Dokgoyeon stopped him. He didn't immediately understand why he couldn't open it, to which Dokgoyeon explained that it was Yuan who had to open the chest. Dokgoyeon replied that S-Light was the unluckiest of them all, a sentiment with which Rushel agreed. However, S-Light himself wasn't particularly pleased with such remarks. Yuan himself was not averse to opening the chest, hoping that there would be something truly valuable inside. When they opened the chest, they experienced a wow effect, but alas, not in a good way. Inside lay an unknown object, resembling a scepter or a magic wand.